Hey guys, tonight we begin our journey by exploring a question that seems glamorous on the surface but was, in reality, a nightmare. We're asking, why did it suck to be a gladiator in ancient Rome? You are, in the eyes of Roman law, infamous. You have no legal rights. You are property, an object. You might be famous, your image scratched into walls by fans, but you can't vote, testify in court, or even make a will. The ghost stories only grew more intense once the submarine was on active duty. Crew members reported seeing a spectral figure, often described as one of their dead comrades, standing on the deck or moving through the control room. The sightings were often followed by equipment malfunctions or other near disasters. The submarine's captain, Karl Donitz, who would later become the Grand Admiral of the Nazi Navy in World War II, was a rational man and tried to dismiss the stories as the product of stress and cramped living conditions. But the fear was palpable. One sailor reportedly went mad after seeing the apparition, screaming and trying to flee the submarine while it was submerged. The UB-65, despite its haunted reputation, was a moderately successful warship. It sank several Allied merchant ships during its patrols, but its career came to a sudden and mysterious end on July 10, 1918, off the coast of Ireland. The official account comes from the crew of an American submarine, the USSL-2, which was patrolling the same area. The American captain reported seeing a German U-boat sitting stationary on the surface. As they prepared to fire a torpedo, the German submarine was suddenly torn apart by a massive internal explosion. It sank immediately, with the loss of all 37 hands on board. The Americans were baffled, as they hadn't even fired their weapon yet. The official explanation at the time was that the UB-65 was likely destroyed by one of its own torpedoes circling back on itself, a known and terrifying malfunction. Another theory is that it hit a stray German mine. But this is where the legend of the gold comes in. Over the years, a story began to circulate that the UB-65 was on a secret mission. It was said to be carrying a huge cargo of gold, worth millions of dollars, destined for Irish nationalist rebels to help fund their fight against the British. The gold was meant to be a secret payment to destabilize the United Kingdom from within. According to this theory, the explosion was no accident. It was an act of sabotage, either by a British intelligence agent who had infiltrated the German Navy, or perhaps by a loyal German crewman who discovered the, quote, traitorous plan to aid the Irish and decided to scuttle the ship rather than let the mission succeed. The story has all the elements of a great spy thriller: a cursed submarine, a ghost, a secret mission, a fortune in gold, and a mysterious fiery end. It's a tantalizing tale that has fueled decades of speculation and numerous, so far unsuccessful, attempts to locate the wreck and its supposed treasure. So is there any truth to the legend? The historical evidence is, to be blunt, extremely thin. There are no official German records that mention a shipment of gold on the UB-65. While Germany did have a policy of trying to stir up trouble for the British in Ireland, a massive gold payment via a U-boat seems like an incredibly risky and unlikely method. Smuggling weapons and agents was one thing, but a cargo of gold would have been heavy, bulky, and difficult to transfer secretly. Most historians believe the gold story is a classic piece of folklore, a legend that grew up around an already spooky and mysterious shipwreck. The ghost stories themselves are likely a product of the immense psychological pressure of submarine service in World War I. Life on a U-boat was terrifying. You were in a cramped, foul-smelling metal tube, deep underwater, constantly hunted by enemy ships dropping depth charges. The air was thick, with the smell of diesel fuel and unwashed bodies. Death was a constant companion. In such an environment, it's not surprising that the crew's fears and anxieties would manifest as ghost stories, especially on a boat that had already seen so much death before it even went to sea. And yet, the legend of the UB-65 and its lost gold endures. It's a story that's just too good to let go of. It speaks to our fascination with lost treasures and unsolved mysteries. The wreck of the UB-65 has never been definitively located and identified, though several potential sites have been explored. As long as it remains lost in the cold, dark waters off the Irish coast, the legend will continue. It remains a ghost ship in more ways than one, haunted by the memory of its crew, by the stories of its spectral visitor, and by the glittering, almost certainly imaginary, promise of a lost fortune in gold. Let's leave the cold Atlantic and travel to the warm, arid landscape of the American Southwest. to a place that represents one of the greatest archaeological puzzles in North America. Let's talk about Chaco Canyon. Located in a remote corner of northwestern New Mexico, Chaco Canyon was the center of a thriving and sophisticated ancestral Puebloan culture for over 400 years, from about 850 to 1250 AD. The people of Chaco built massive multi-story stone buildings known as, quote, great houses, on a scale unmatched anywhere north of Mexico until the 19th century. And then, for reasons we still don't fully understand, they left. The scale of the construction at Chaco is simply breathtaking, especially when you consider the environment. This is a high desert with short growing seasons, unpredictable rainfall, and scarce resources. Yet, in this challenging landscape, the Chacoan people constructed more than a dozen spectacular great houses. The largest of these, Pueblo Bonito, was a D-shaped complex that covered 2 acres, stood 4 stories high in some places, and contained over 650 rooms. It was the largest apartment building in North America until modern steel-framed skyscrapers were built in New York City. And it was all built without wheeled vehicles, draft animals, or metal tools. The architectural planning and masonry skills of the Chacoans were extraordinary. The walls of the great houses were built with a core and veneer technique, using carefully selected sandstone blocks fitted together with mud mortar. The buildings were precisely aligned to astronomical events, such as the solstices and equinoxes. Doorways and windows were lined up to create sight lines that marked the passage of the sun and moon. The entire canyon seems to have been designed as a massive sacred landscape, a center for ceremony, trade, and celestial observation. It was a complex, ordered world, built with incredible labor and a profound understanding of the cosmos. Your training is monotonous and brutal. You swing a heavy wooden sword to the ludus for hours. You learn to die convincingly, to appeal to the crowd for mercy. You practice not just fighting, but the performance of violence. One of the most baffling features of Chaco Canyon is the extensive network of roads that radiate out from it. These aren't simple footpaths. They are broad, remarkably straight engineered roads, up to 30 feet wide. They were excavated, leveled, and sometimes bordered with stone. They run for hundreds of miles, connecting the central canyon to over 150 other great houses scattered across the San Juan Basin. The strange thing is, these roads often ignore topography. They go straight up and over steep mesas and down cliffs, where carved stairways were cut into the rock. Since the Chacoans had no wheeled vehicles, the purpose of these wide, straight roads is a deep mystery. Some archaeologists believe the roads were not primarily for transportation, at least not in the practical sense. They may have been sacred pathways, used for religious processions or pilgrimages, their straight lines symbolizing a spiritual journey. Others suggest they were part of a vast signaling system, or a way of marking the Chacoan sphere of influence across the landscape. They remain one of the most enigmatic features of this ancient culture. They represent a massive investment of labor for a purpose that is still not entirely clear to us, a testament to a worldview that was very different from our own. The great houses themselves are also full of puzzles. While they have hundreds of rooms, archaeological evidence suggests that relatively few people actually lived in them full-time. Many of the rooms seem to have been used for storage or for ceremonial purposes. This has led to the theory that Chaco Canyon was not a residential city in the modern sense, but a great ritual center. People from the surrounding communities may have traveled along the roads to gather in the canyon for seasonal ceremonies and festivals, with the great houses serving as temporary lodging, storehouses for food, and grand stages for the rituals. The artifacts found at Chaco point to it being a major center of trade and influence. Archaeologists have discovered macaw feathers and copper bells from Mexico, thousands of pieces of turquoise from mines hundreds of miles away, and elaborate pottery with unique black-on-white designs. They also found cylindrical pottery vessels, similar to those used by the Maya to drink cacao. Chemical analysis has confirmed that these vessels did indeed contain residue of theobromine, the stimulant found in chocolate. This means the elite of Chaco Canyon, in the middle of the New Mexico desert, were drinking hot chocolate as a ritual beverage over 1,000 years ago. And then, around the year 1130 AD, a profound change occurred. A major drought, which we can see in the tree ring data, gripped the region for several decades. New construction in the canyon slowed and then stopped altogether. By the mid-1200s, The great houses were largely empty. The people of Chaco had packed up and left. The great ceremonial center was abandoned to the wind and the sun. This abandonment is the central mystery of Chaco. Why did they leave? The drought is certainly a major factor. Life in an already marginal environment would have become incredibly difficult. But the story may be more complicated than just climate change. Some archaeologists see evidence of growing social and political turmoil in the final years of Chaco. The later construction shows more defensive features. There is also some grim evidence of violence and perhaps even ritual cannibalism at some outlying sites, suggesting a breakdown of the old social order. It's possible that the environmental stress exacerbated internal conflicts. The religious and political system that had been so successful for centuries may have failed to provide answers or solutions when the rains stopped, leading to a loss of faith and the ultimate collapse of the Chacoan world. The people of Chaco Canyon didn't just vanish. They migrated, moving to other areas in the southwest, like Mesa Verde in Colorado or the Rio Grande Valley in New Mexico. Their descendants are the modern Pueblo peoples of Arizona and New Mexico, who still hold Chaco as a sacred ancestral site. Their oral traditions speak of Chaco as a great gathering place, but also as a place where things went wrong. A lesson in the dangers of ambition and overreach. Chaco Canyon remains a place of profound mystery and power, a silent, beautiful testament to a remarkable civilization that rose, flourished, and fell in the heart of the American desert. Let's turn our attention now to a single object, but an object of immense power and controversy. Let's talk about the Koh-i-Noor diamond. It is one of the largest cut diamonds in the world, weighing just over 105 carats, and it is the dazzling centerpiece of the Queen Mother's crown, part of the British crown jewels. But the Koh-i-Noor, which means mountain of light in Persian, is more than just a gemstone. It is an object with a long, bloody, and contested history. Depending on who you ask, it is either a glorious spoil of war and a symbol of imperial pride, or a stolen treasure and a painful reminder of colonial subjugation. The earliest verifiable history of the Koh-i-Noor begins in the 16th century, with the Mughal emperors of India. The diamond was likely mined in the Golconda region of southern India, the source of many of the world's most famous diamonds. For centuries, it was passed down through the Mughal dynasty, a symbol of their immense wealth and power. It was said to have been set in the famous peacock throne of Emperor Shah Jahan, the same emperor who built the Taj Mahal. The Mughal court was legendary for its opulence, and the Koh-i-Noor was one of its most prized possessions. The curse associated with the diamond is said to have originated from a Hindu text, which stated, "He who owns this diamond will own the world, but will also know all its misfortunes. Only God, or a woman, can wear it with impunity." This prophecy would seem to come true again and again. In 1739, the Persian Emperor Nader Shah invaded the Mughal Empire and sacked the city of Delhi. He plundered the Mughal treasury, but he couldn't find the famous diamond. Legend has it that a member of the deposed emperor's harem told Nader Shah that the emperor, Muhammad Shah, was hiding the diamond in his turban. The fear is constant. It's a low hum beneath every moment of your day. The knowledge that your life could end for the entertainment of a bored politician or a rowdy mob is a heavy, inescapable weight. At a victory celebration, Nader Shah cleverly proposed a traditional exchange of turbans with Muhammad Shah as a gesture of friendship and brotherhood. The defeated Mughal emperor had no choice but to accept. Later, in private, Nader Shah unrolled the turban and the magnificent diamond fell out. It was he who is said to have exclaimed Koh-i-Noor, giving the diamond its modern name. But the curse seemed to follow him. His reign grew increasingly tyrannical, and he was assassinated by his own officers just 8 years later. After his death, the diamond fell into the hands of one of his generals, who founded the Durrani Empire in what is now Afghanistan. For the next several decades, the Koh-i-Noor passed through a succession of Afghan rulers, its ownership often decided by betrayal, torture, and murder. One ruler was blinded with a hot needle by his own brother in a fight for the throne. The diamond was a bringer of great power, but also of great suffering. In the early 19th century, a deposed Afghan ruler fled to India, seeking refuge with the powerful Sikh ruler of Punjab, Maharaja Ranjit Singh. The Afghan ruler had the Koh-i-Noor with him, and Ranjit Singh, known as the Lion of the Punjab, was determined to get it. He effectively held the Afghan ruler and his family hostage, depriving them of food and water, until the diamond was handed over in 1813. Ranjit Singh was immensely proud of the diamond and would wear it on his arm during state occasions. He became the last Indian ruler to possess the Koh-i-Noor. But after his death in 1839, the Sikh Empire fell into disarray, plagued by infighting and assassinations. This instability provided an opportunity for the British East India Company, which was rapidly expanding its control over the subcontinent. After a series of brutal conflicts known as the Anglo-Sikh Wars, the British annexed the Punjab in 1849. The last Sikh emperor was a young boy named Duleep Singh. As part of the peace treaty, the Treaty of Lahore, the 10-year-old Duleep Singh was forced to cede the Koh-i-Noor diamond to the Queen of England. The wording is crucial. The British have always maintained that the diamond was a legitimate part of a legal treaty, but for many Indians, Pakistanis, and Afghans, it was an act of theft, a treasure extorted from a child ruler at gunpoint. The diamond was shipped to Britain and presented to Queen Victoria in 1850. It was put on display at the Great Exhibition of 1851, but the British public was underwhelmed. In its original Indian cut, it didn't sparkle much. Prince Albert, Queen Victoria's husband, decided the diamond needed a makeover to suit Western tastes. He ordered it to be recut, a highly controversial decision. The recutting process was a nerve-wracking affair, as there was a risk of shattering the priceless stone. The diamond was cut down from its original 186 carats to its current 105.6 carats. The process dramatically increased its brilliance and sparkle, but it also erased much of its original history and form. Queen Victoria wore it as a brooch, but after her, mindful of the curse, it has only ever been worn by female members of the royal family, set in the crowns of Queen Alexandra, Queen Mary, and finally, Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother. Today, the Koh-i-Noor remains a deeply contentious object. The governments of India, Pakistan, Afghanistan, and even Iran have all, at various times, laid claim to the diamond and demanded its return. For them, it is a potent symbol of their colonial past and a piece of their heritage that was stolen from them. The British government has consistently rejected these claims, arguing that the diamond was legally acquired under the terms of a treaty and that returning it would set a dangerous precedent for other museum artifacts. The Koh-i-Noor is therefore more than just a rock. It is a focal point for debates about colonialism, ownership, and the restitution of cultural artifacts. It is a mountain of light that casts a very long and very dark shadow. Let's shift our gaze from a single, glittering object to a vast, sprawling structure of stone and secrets. We're going to explore the strange and controversial history of the Great Wall of China. It's one of the most iconic man-made structures on Earth, a symbol of China's immense power and enduring civilization. But the story of the wall is not as simple as we often imagine. It wasn't built as a single, continuous project, and its purpose was far more complex than just keeping out invaders. It's a story of many walls, built by many dynasties, for many different reasons, and its legacy is a complicated tapestry of defense, politics, and human suffering. The popular image of the Great Wall, a massive, continuous stone rampart snaking over mountains, is largely a myth. This image is based almost entirely on the sections of the wall built during the Ming Dynasty, 1368 to 1644, particularly the well-preserved sections near Beijing that are popular with tourists. In reality, the Great Wall is a series of non-contiguous walls, fortresses, and watchtowers, built over a period of more than 2,000 years. The earliest fortifications date back to the 7th century BC, when various Chinese states built earthen walls to defend against each other and against nomadic tribes from the north. The first emperor to unify many of these early walls was Qin Shi Huang, the same emperor famous for the Terracotta Army in the 3rd century BC. After unifying China, he sought to create a single defensive line against the Xiongnu nomads to the north. His wall was not made of stone and brick, but was primarily constructed of rammed earth, a technique where soil and gravel are compacted into solid, durable blocks. This early wall was a monumental undertaking, built by a massive workforce of soldiers, commoners, and convicts. It was a brutal project, and countless workers died from exhaustion, disease, and accidents. The wall became known as the longest cemetery on Earth. Subsequent dynasties, like the Han, continued to build and extend the walls, pushing further west into the desert to protect the lucrative Silk Road trade routes. These sections were often built of layered sand and reeds, For many centuries, the wall was not a static defensive line, but a dynamic border zone. It was a system for controlling trade, levying taxes on caravans, and serving as a communication network. Watchtowers, spaced within sight of each other, could use smoke signals by day and fire by night to quickly relay information about troop movements along the frontier. It was a kind of celestial surveillance system made of earth and fire. Let's talk about the gear. It looks impressive from the stands, all polished bronze and plumes. But up close, it's heavy, awkward, and often designed to create a specific dramatic matchup rather than for your actual protection. It's important to understand that for much of its history, the wall was not particularly effective at its primary supposed purpose, keeping people out. Powerful nomadic armies like those of the Mongols led by Genghis Khan were able to bypass the wall, go around it, or simply bribe the guards at the gates. The wall was more of a political statement than a truly impenetrable military barrier. It was a powerful symbol of the boundary between the civilized agricultural society of China to the south and the barbarian nomadic cultures of the steppes to the north. It was a line drawn on the map, and in the mind as much as it was a line on the ground. Most famous and impressive sections of the wall, the ones we see today, were built by the Ming dynasty. The Ming had overthrown the Mongol Yuan dynasty and were deeply concerned about a potential Mongol resurgence. They embarked on a massive, centuries-long building project to create a formidable stone and brick barrier. This Ming wall was a masterpiece of military engineering, with massive forts, barracks, and watchtowers. It was wider, taller, and far more sophisticated than any of the previous walls. This is the wall of our imagination, a stone dragon winding its way across the northern Chinese landscape. The construction of the Ming Wall was an incredible feat of logistics. Millions of tons of stone, brick, and lime had to be quarried, manufactured, and transported to remote and mountainous locations. The workforce was immense, consisting of soldiers, conscripted laborers, and prisoners. The human cost was, once again, enormous. It was a project that consumed a huge portion of the Ming state's budget and manpower for generations. And in the end, even this mighty wall failed to save the dynasty that built it. The fall of the Ming dynasty in 1644 came not because the wall was breached by force, but because of betrayal from within. A Ming general named Wu Sangui, who was guarding a critical pass at Shanhai Pass where the wall meets the sea, felt threatened by a rebel army that had captured Beijing. He made a fateful decision. He opened the gates of the Great Wall and allowed the Manchu armies from the north to pour through. The Manchus helped him defeat the rebels, but then they refused to leave. They marched on Beijing and established their own dynasty, the Qing dynasty, which would rule China until 1912. The Great Wall, the ultimate symbol of defense against northern invaders, was ultimately undone by a single open gate. Under the Qing dynasty, who were themselves from Manchuria north of the wall, the structure lost its military purpose. It was no longer a border, but something deep inside their own empire. The wall was largely abandoned and fell into disrepair. It was only in the 20th century, with the rise of Chinese nationalism, that the Great Wall was revived as a powerful symbol of the Chinese nation itself. It became a source of pride, a testament to the endurance and strength of the Chinese people, a tourist icon, and a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Its meaning transformed from a failed military defense into a successful cultural symbol. So, the Great Wall of China is a far more complex and tragic story than the postcards suggest. It's a story of immense ambition, incredible engineering, and unimaginable human suffering. It's a story of a project that was never really one wall, and that never really worked as intended. It stands today as a silent, winding monument to the age-old, often futile, human desire to build walls to solve political problems, and as a powerful reminder that the greatest threats often come not from the outside, but from within. It is less a wall and more a long, winding scar on the landscape of history. Now let's journey from the sprawling walls of China to the opulent, claustrophobic world of the Russian imperial court in the early 20th century. We're going to meet a figure who is perhaps one of the most mysterious and maligned characters in modern history, Grigory Rasputin. He was a Siberian peasant, a wandering mystic, and a self-proclaimed holy man who managed to gain incredible influence over the last Tsar and Tsarina of Russia, Nicholas II and Alexandra Fyodorovna. To his supporters, he was a saintly healer. To his enemies, he was a debauched charlatan, a demonic puppet master who was leading Russia to ruin. The truth, as always, is somewhere in the murky middle. Grigory Yefimovich Novik was born in a remote Siberian village in 1869. He had little formal education and remained functionally illiterate for his entire life. As a young man, he gained a reputation for being rebellious and dissolute, and he was given the name Rasputin, which in Russian means the debauched one. However, after a religious conversion experience, he left his family and spent years as a a wandering pilgrim, traveling to monasteries and holy sites across Russia. He developed a charismatic, intense presence and a reputation as a faith healer and a starets or spiritual elder. Rasputin's big break came in 1905 when he was introduced to the imperial family. The Tsar and, more importantly, the Tsarina Alexandra were deeply religious and drawn to mysticism. They were also desperate. Their only son and heir to the throne, Alexei, suffered from hemophilia, a genetic disorder that prevents blood from clotting properly. Even a small cut or bruise could lead to a life-threatening bleed. The doctors of the court were powerless to help, and Alexandra lived in a state of constant terror for her son's life. This desperation made her vulnerable to anyone who offered a glimmer of hope. Rasputin seemed to be that hope. On several occasions when Alexei was suffering from a bleeding episode, Rasputin was called to the palace, and after his visits, the boy's condition would improve. Historians and doctors have debated how he did this for a century. He didn't use medicine. His methods involved fervent prayer and a calm, hypnotic presence. The most likely explanation is that his calming influence on the frantic Tsarina Alexandra would, in turn, calm the child. This reduction in stress would have lowered Alexei's blood pressure, slowing the bleeding. Also, Rasputin famously insisted that the doctors be kept away, and the doctors at the time were fond of prescribing aspirin, which we now know is a blood thinner and would have made the hemophilia much worse. By simply stopping the conventional treatment, he inadvertently helped the boy. You might be a retiarius, armed with only a net and a trident, facing a secutor who is almost fully encased in armor. The fight is deliberately unfair, a piece of theater engineered for maximum suspense and bloodshed. To the Tsarina, it was nothing short of a miracle. She came to believe that Rasputin was a holy man sent by God to save her son and, by extension, Russia itself. She called him our friend and the holy man, and she refused to listen to any criticism of him. This gave Rasputin unprecedented access to the royal family, and, through them, enormous influence. He became a fixture at the court, a coarse, unkempt Siberian peasant in a world of refined, French-speaking aristocrats. The nobility was scandalized and deeply resentful of his power. Rumors began to swirl about Rasputin's behavior outside the palace. He was said to engage in wild, drunken orgies and to have seduced countless women, from high society ladies to humble maids. He preached a strange doctrine of sinning to find salvation, arguing that true repentance could only be achieved after experiencing profound sin. While many of these stories were undoubtedly exaggerated by his enemies to discredit him, Rasputin did little to discourage them. He lived a life of stark contrasts, moving between pious prayer sessions with the Tsarina and debauched parties in the city. This behavior only fueled the hatred and suspicion against him. The situation became critical during World War I. In 1915, Tsar Nicholas II made the disastrous decision to go to the front lines to take personal command of the army. He left the day-to-day governance of the country in the hands of the Tsarina Alexandra, and Alexandra, in turn, relied heavily on the advice of Rasputin. Suddenly, a semi-literate peasant mystic was effectively influencing ministerial appointments and government policy in the middle of a catastrophic war. He would recommend incompetent cronies for high office, and Alexandra would ensure they were appointed. This led to chaos in the government and fueled the belief among the public and the elite that the country was being run by a mad German Tsarina and her demonic Siberian puppet. By late 1916, a group of conservative aristocrats, including the Tsar's own cousin, decided that Rasputin had to be eliminated to save the monarchy from itself. They were led by Prince Felix Yusupov, one of the wealthiest men in Russia. They lured Rasputin to Yusupov's palace on the pretext of a party. What followed has become the stuff of legend, a story of an almost superhuman death, according to Yusupov's own, probably embellished account. They first fed Rasputin cakes and wine laced with enough cyanide to kill several men. To their horror, the poison seemed to have no effect. In a panic, Yusupov shot Rasputin in the chest with a revolver. The mystic collapsed, and the conspirators thought he was dead. But as they examined the body, Rasputin suddenly leaped up, roaring, and attacked Yusupov. He then staggered out into the courtyard, trying to escape. The other conspirators shot him 3 more times, and one of them beat him savagely with a club. Finally, to be absolutely sure, they wrapped his body in a sheet, drove it to a bridge over the freezing Neva River, and pushed it through a hole in the ice. When his body was recovered a few days later, the autopsy found water in his lungs, suggesting that even after being poisoned, shot 4 times, and bludgeoned, Rasputin had still been alive when he hit the water, and had ultimately died by drowning. The conspirators believed that by killing Rasputin, they would be hailed as heroes who had saved Russia. They were wrong. The murder only served to highlight the decay and incompetence at the heart of the regime. The Tsarina was devastated, and the Tsar's authority was further weakened. Just a few months later, in March 1917, the February Revolution broke out, and the Tsar was forced to abdicate. The Romanov dynasty, which had ruled for 300 years, was over. The murder of Rasputin did not save the monarchy. It was merely the final, lurid act in its long and tragic collapse. Grigory Rasputin remains a fascinating and deeply ambiguous figure. Was he a saint or a sinner, a healer or a charlatan? The truth is, he was likely a complex and contradictory mix of all these things. He was a man of genuine, if unorthodox, faith, who also possessed a shrewd understanding of power and a weakness for earthly pleasures. His story is not just about him, but about the desperate, decadent, and doomed world of the last Romanovs, a world so detached from reality that it allowed a figure like Rasputin to rise to its very center, just as the entire edifice was about to come crashing down. Let's turn our attention now to the world of art and science, and to a mystery that has puzzled scholars for over a century. We're going to talk about the Voynich manuscript. It is a handwritten and illustrated book, a codex, that is written in a completely unknown language or code. Its pages are filled with intricate drawings of fantastical plants, astronomical diagrams, and strange human figures, often bathing in green liquid. Carbon dated to the early 15th century, the manuscript has defied every attempt at decipherment, earning it the nickname, the world's most mysterious book. It's a puzzle box from the past, a message we can see but cannot read. The manuscript is named after Wilfrid Voynich, a Polish-American rare book dealer who acquired it in 1912 from a Jesuit college near Rome. Its known history before that is patchy, but it seems to have passed through the hands of some notable figures, including the Holy Roman Emperor Rudolph II in the 16th century, who was a famous collector of curiosities and occult objects. The emperor believed it was the work of the 13th century English friar and philosopher Roger Bacon. Since Voynich rediscovered it, the manuscript has been studied by some of the world's best cryptographers and linguists, including the codebreakers who cracked German and Japanese ciphers during World War II. None have succeeded. The text itself is what makes the manuscript so baffling. It's written from left to right in a flowing, elegant script. The alphabet, often called Voynichese, consists of about 20 to 30 unique characters that don't correspond to any known language. The text appears to follow consistent linguistic rules. Certain characters appear more often than others. Some letter combinations are common while others are rare, and the word length and structure seem to be systematic. Statistical analysis has shown that it has patterns similar to those of real languages, which has led most researchers to believe it's not just random gibberish. It seems to be a real language, or a very sophisticated cipher. The roar of the crowd is a strange thing. It's a wave of adoration and bloodlust all at once. They cheer for your skill, but they're also cheering for the possibility of your spectacular death. You are their hero and their sacrifice. The illustrations are just as mysterious as the text. The manuscript is generally divided into several sections based on the drawings. The first and largest is the herbal section, which features detailed drawings of over 100 different plants. The strange thing is, almost none of these plants can be identified. They appear to be completely fantastical, composites of different real plants or species that are now extinct or simply unknown. Each plant is accompanied by a block of the unreadable text, presumably describing it. It's like a field guide to a world that doesn't exist. The next section is the astronomical or astrological section. This contains circular diagrams that look like star charts or zodiacs. There are drawings of the sun, the moon, and clusters of stars, often with elaborate flowing lines connecting them. Some of the symbols resemble zodiac signs, but they are often arranged in strange and unconventional ways. Again, the diagrams are surrounded by the mysterious script, perhaps explaining their meaning or purpose. It's a glimpse into a cosmic model that is completely alien to us. Perhaps the most bizarre part of the manuscript is the balneological section, from a word meaning related to bathing. This section is filled with drawings of small, naked female figures, often wearing strange crowns, bathing in a complex network of pools and pipes. The liquid they are bathing in is usually colored green or blue. The purpose of these drawings is completely unknown. Are they illustrating a medical or alchemical procedure? A religious ritual? A creation myth? The scenes are surreal and dreamlike, offering no easy explanation. Other sections include a pharmaceutical part with drawings of what look like apothecary jars and plant roots, and a final section that consists of solid blocks of text with small, star-like markers in the margins, which some have called a recipe section. The entire book feels like a comprehensive encyclopedia of a lost world, a guide to its botany, astronomy, and perhaps its medicine and spirituality. But without the key to its language, it remains a silent, beautiful enigma. So what is the Voynich manuscript? The theories are endless. One possibility is that it's an elaborate hoax, created in the 15th or 16th century to fool a wealthy collector like Emperor Rudolph II. The creator could have just invented a plausible-looking script and a series of strange drawings to create a valuable and mysterious object. However, the linguistic complexity of the text makes this a difficult theory to sustain. It would have required a genius-level understanding of linguistics to create a fake language with such consistent and subtle patterns. Another theory is that it's a real text, written in a real, but unknown, language. Perhaps it's an early attempt to create a constructed, artificial language, like Esperanto, centuries before its time. Or maybe it's a known language that has been written down using a substitution cipher, where each letter is replaced by a symbol. However, all attempts to decode it as a simple cipher have failed. If it is a code, it's an incredibly complex one, perhaps involving multiple layers of encryption. A more recent and intriguing theory suggests that the manuscript is a unique creation of a single, perhaps isolated, individual. It could be the work of someone with a brilliant but unconventional mind, a kind of outsider artist of the 15th century, who created a personal, symbolic language to express their own unique vision of the world. The manuscript might not be meant to be read in the conventional sense at all, but is rather a kind of visual poem or a meditative object. This would explain its deeply personal and idiosyncratic nature. Today, the Voynich manuscript is housed at the Beinecke Rare Book and Manuscript Library at Yale University. It has been fully digitized and is available online, allowing a global community of amateur and professional sleuths to continue the quest to unlock its secrets. It remains one of the greatest unsolved puzzles in the history of cryptography and linguistics. It is a testament to the fact that even in our age of information and data analysis, there are still mysteries from the past that can utterly defeat us. It's a book that holds a mirror up to our own desire for meaning, a silent, beautiful, and utterly frustrating masterpiece of the unknown. Let's now travel back to the Age of Sail, to the high seas of the early 18th century, and explore a story that shatters our romanticized image of pirates. We're going to talk about the pirate ship Whydah Galley and its captain Black Sam Bellamy. The story of the Whydah is not just about treasure and adventure. It's a remarkable story of a pirate society that was, in many ways, more democratic, egalitarian, and multicultural than the so-called civilized nations that hunted them. And it's a story with a dramatic, tragic end and a stunning modern discovery. Samuel Bellamy, known as Black Sam because he eschewed the fashionable powdered wig in favor of his long, black hair tied back with a simple band, was not your typical pirate captain. He began his career as a sailor in the British Royal Navy, but like many sailors of his time, he grew tired of the brutal discipline, low pay, and terrible conditions. He left the Navy to become a treasure hunter, but when that failed, he turned to piracy in 1716. He quickly rose through the ranks, and his fellow pirates elected him as their captain. The smell of the arena is overwhelming. It's hot sand, blood, sweat, the metallic tang of fear, and the cloying perfume they spray to try and mask the stench of death. It's the scent of a human slaughterhouse. Bellamy styled himself as a Robin Hood of the seas. He saw himself and his crew not as common thieves, but as righteous rebels fighting against the oppressive and corrupt system of merchant captains and naval officers. There's a famous speech, recorded by one of his captured victims, where Bellamy lays out his philosophy. He says, "I am a free prince, and I have as much authority to make war on the whole world as he who has 100 sail of ships at sea. They vilify us, the scoundrels do, when there is only this difference. They plunder the poor under the cover of law, forsooth, and we plunder the rich under the protection of our own courage." Life aboard Bellamy's ship was governed by a strict code of conduct, the Pirate Articles, which every crew member had to agree to. These articles created a surprisingly democratic and fair society. The captain was elected and could be removed by a vote of the crew. The loot was divided into shares, with the captain and quartermaster receiving only slightly more than a regular crewman. There was a form of workers' compensation. A man who lost a limb in battle would receive a larger share of the treasure. It was a meritocracy, where skill and bravery were valued above all else. The crew of the Whydah was also incredibly diverse, a floating United Nations of the disenfranchised. It was made up of sailors from Britain, Ireland, the American colonies, and several other European countries. Crucially, about a third of the crew was of African descent. Many of them were escaped slaves from the sugar plantations of the Caribbean, who found a level of freedom and equality on a pirate ship that was unimaginable anywhere else in the world at that time. On the Whydah, they were free men, entitled to a vote, a share of the treasure, and the right to bear arms. Piracy for them was not just a crime, it was a radical act of liberation. In February 1717, Bellamy and his crew captured their greatest prize, the Whydah galley. The Whydah was a brand new, state-of-the-art slave ship. On its maiden voyage, it had transported hundreds of enslaved Africans to the Caribbean, and it was now on its return leg to London, its hold filled with the immense profits from that horrific trade: gold, silver, ivory, and indigo. Bellamy captured the ship without a fight and made it his new flagship. For the next few months, they were the most successful pirates on the Atlantic, capturing dozens of other ships. Black Sam Bellamy became the wealthiest pirate in recorded history, but Bellamy's triumphant reign was to be short-lived. He was sailing north, up the coast of America, reportedly to visit his lover Maria Hallett in Cape Cod. On the night of April 26, 1717, as the Whydah and its fleet neared the coast of Massachusetts, they were caught in a violent storm, a classic nor'easter. The Whydah, top-heavy with its cannons and the immense weight of its treasure, was driven toward the shore. In the middle of the night, the ship's main mast snapped, and the vessel capsized in the churning waves, breaking apart on a sandbar just 500 feet from the beach. The disaster was almost total. Of the 146 men on board the Whydah, only 2 survived. Black Sam Bellamy went down with his ship, along with the greatest pirate treasure ever amassed. The colonial authorities on Cape Cod recovered some of the wreckage and a handful of bodies that washed ashore. The few survivors from the other ships in Bellamy's fleet were captured, put on trial in Boston, and most were hanged. The story of the Whydah galley and its legendary treasure passed into folklore, a dramatic tale of pirate democracy, immense wealth, and sudden, tragic death. For over 260 years, the wreck of the Whydah and its treasure lay hidden beneath the shifting sands of the Cape Cod coast. Then, in 1984, an underwater explorer and treasure hunter named Barry Clifford, who had been obsessed with the story since he was a boy, finally located the wreck site. He found a ship's bell, and when he cleaned it, the inscription was clear: the Whydah Galley, 1716. It was the first, and to this day, the only fully authenticated Golden Age pirate shipwreck ever discovered. The excavation of the Whydah has yielded an incredible treasure trove, not just of gold and silver, but of historical artifacts that give us an unprecedented glimpse into the real lives of pirates. Clifford and his team have recovered over 200,000 artifacts, including thousands of Spanish silver coins, gold bars, cannons, pistols, and everyday objects like pewter plates, navigation tools, and even a small human leg bone found inside a silk stocking and a shoe. a poignant and personal reminder of the human tragedy. The treasure is not just valuable, it's a time capsule of a lost world. The discovery of the Whydah has allowed historians to confirm many of the details about pirate life that were previously known only from biased historical accounts written by their enemies. The artifacts paint a picture of a complex society that was violent and criminal, but also surprisingly progressive for its time. The Whydah Galley's story forces us to look beyond the swashbuckling caricature of pirates and see them as they often were: rebellious, multinational, and radically democratic outcasts who created their own brief but surprisingly fair-minded society in defiance of a brutal and unjust world. Now let's turn from the high seas to the quiet, dusty shelves of a library, and to a book that caused one of the greatest scandals in the history of scholarship. We're going to talk about the Donation of Constantine, a document that was used for centuries to justify the immense political and territorial power of the papacy. It was one of the most successful and consequential forgeries of all time. Its story is a fascinating tale of power, propaganda, and the slow, methodical work of a scholar who dared to prove the emperor had no clothes, or in this case, that the pope had no deed. Then there is the moment of truth. You're wounded, on the ground. You raise a finger, appealing for missio for mercy. Your fate is now in the hands of the crowd and the editor of the games. A thumb turned. Which way? No one is quite sure. The Donation of Constantine was a document that purported to be a decree from the first Christian Roman emperor, Constantine the Great, written in the 4th century. The document tells a dramatic story. It claims that Emperor Constantine was suffering from leprosy and was miraculously cured by Pope Sylvester I. In gratitude for this healing and for his conversion to Christianity, Constantine, before he moved the capital of the empire to Constantinople, made a grand donation to the Pope. He supposedly gave the Pope and his successors dominion over the city of Rome, over all of Italy, and over all the western provinces of the Roman Empire. The document effectively made the Pope the political successor to the Roman emperors in the West. It also granted the Pope a status superior to all other religious leaders, and gave the clergy of Rome the same honors and privileges as the Roman senators. It was a staggering grant of power and prestige. If the document was genuine, it meant that the Pope's claim to be a temporal political ruler with vast territories, the Papal States, was not a later ambition, but a right that had been legally bestowed upon the Church by the very first Christian emperor. The document first appeared in the mid-8th century, a time when the papacy was in a precarious political position. The Byzantine Empire's power in Italy was weakening, and the popes were threatened by the Lombards, a Germanic tribe that controlled much of northern Italy. The popes needed a powerful ally, and they found one in the Franks, led by Pepin the Short and later his son Charlemagne. The Donation of Constantine was likely forged around this time to provide a legal and historical justification for the pope's claims to temporal power, and to bolster his authority in his negotiations with these new Frankish rulers. For the next 700 years, the Donation of Constantine was a cornerstone of papal authority. It was cited in legal arguments, used to justify political actions, and accepted as historical fact throughout medieval Europe. Popes used it to assert their supremacy over secular kings and emperors. It was included in major collections of canon law. While some people expressed doubts about its authenticity over the centuries, no one had been able to definitively prove it was a fake. The document was too powerful, and the Church's authority was too absolute to be challenged directly. That all changed in the 15th century, during the height of the Italian Renaissance. The Renaissance saw a renewed interest in classical antiquity and the development of a new, critical approach to historical texts. Scholars were no longer content to simply accept ancient documents at face value. They began to analyze them with a new intellectual rigor, a practice known as humanism. And one of the greatest of these humanist scholars was a man named Lorenzo Valla. Lorenzo Valla was an Italian Catholic priest, a brilliant scholar, and an expert in the Latin language. In 1440, while working for the King of Naples, who was in a political dispute with the Pope, Valla was asked to examine the Donation of Constantine. He applied his formidable skills in philology, the historical study of language, to the document, and what he found was a mountain of evidence that it was a forgery. His analysis was a brilliant piece of historical detective work. Valla pointed out dozens of anachronisms and impossibilities in the text. The Latin vocabulary and style used in the document were completely wrong for the 4th century. It contained words like fief and turns of phrase that only came into use in the 8th century, the so-called barbarous Latin of the early Middle Ages, not the classical Latin of Constantine's time. He also pointed out historical errors. The document has Constantine referring to Constantinople, as if it were already the capital, but at the time the document was supposedly written, the city was still called Byzantium. Vala's arguments were meticulous and overwhelming. He showed that the document mentioned things that hadn't happened yet, used language that hadn't been invented yet, and described a political situation that didn't exist in the 4th century. He concluded, with devastating certainty, that the donation of Constantine could not possibly have been written by Constantine. It was a clumsy, anachronistic forgery, created centuries after the emperor's death. He had exposed one of the foundational myths of papal power as a complete fraud. Vala's work, Discourse on the Forgery of the Alleged Donation of Constantine, was explosive. At first, he only circulated it in manuscript, but with the invention of the printing press a few years later, his arguments spread like wildfire across Europe. The Catholic Church initially tried to suppress his work and placed it on the index of forbidden books. But it was too late. The damage was done. Vala's demolition of the donation became a key weapon for critics of the papacy, including Martin Luther and the other leaders of the Protestant Reformation a few decades later. The story of the donation of Constantine is a powerful lesson in the importance of critical thinking and historical scrutiny. It shows how a single, fraudulent document can shape the course of history for centuries, and how the careful, methodical work of one scholar can bring a whole edifice of power tumbling down. Lorenzo Vala's work was a triumph of reason and evidence over tradition and authority. He didn't just prove a document was fake. He helped to usher in a new, more critical and honest way of looking at the past. Even if you survive and win, what's the prize? A palm frond, maybe some money. But you go back to the ludus. You do it all again tomorrow or next week. The cycle of dread doesn't end with a single victory. Let's shift our focus now from a forged document to a real and truly bizarre event in American history. We're going to talk about the Great Stork Derby, a strange and troubling contest that took place in Toronto, Canada, during the Great Depression. It was the result of a wealthy, eccentric, and childless lawyer's last will and testament, which set off a 10-year baby-making race that captivated and horrified the public in equal measure. It's a story about wealth, desperation, and the strange ways that one man's eccentricities can ripple out to affect the lives of dozens of families. The story begins with Charles Vance Millar, a successful but famously eccentric Toronto lawyer and financier. Millar was a notorious practical joker with a cynical view of human nature. He had no wife or children and no close relatives he cared for. As he neared the end of his life, he decided to use his will as one last grand social experiment to prove his belief that everyone has a price and that greed is a primary motivator of human behavior. He died in 1926, and when his will was read, it revealed a series of bizarre and mischievous bequests. Some of the bequests were relatively harmless jokes. He left shares in a brewery to a group of prominent temperance ministers. He left shares in a jockey club to several well-known anti-horse racing activists. But the most famous and most consequential clause was the 9th one. It stipulated that the bulk of his considerable estate, worth about $500,000 at the time, the equivalent of many millions today, was to be liquidated 10 years after his death, and given in cash to the Toronto area woman who had given birth to the most children in that 10-year period. This clause, which quickly became known as the, quote, Great Stork Derby, set off a firestorm of controversy. The will was immediately challenged in court by some of Millar's distant relatives, who argued that it was against public policy and would encourage people to have children for purely financial reasons, essentially turning babies into lottery tickets. The legal battles would drag on for years, creating a cloud of uncertainty over the contest. But for many families in Toronto who were struggling to survive the crushing poverty of the Great Depression, the slim chance of winning a life-changing fortune was too tempting to ignore. And so, the race began. The media followed the story with a mixture of fascination and morbid curiosity, tracking the progress of the leading Stork Derby mothers. The contest turned the intimate act of family planning into a public spectacle. Families would announce new births, and reporters would speculate on their chances. It was a grim reality show played out in the pages of the newspapers. The pressure on the competing families was immense. They were not only dealing with the financial and physical strain of raising a huge number of children in poverty, but also with the constant public scrutiny and the uncertainty of whether the prize would ever actually be paid out. Several women emerged as frontrunners in the contest. They were mostly from poor working-class families who saw the derby as their only hope of escaping a life of desperate poverty. The competition was fierce and not always friendly. Some families accused others of cheating, of passing off stillborn children as live births, or of claiming children that weren't theirs. The contest brought out the best and worst in people, showcasing incredible maternal resilience on the one hand, and the dark side of human greed on the other. After 10 years of legal wrangling and competitive procreation, the deadline arrived on October 31, 1936. The courts finally upheld the validity of Millar's will, and the difficult task of determining the winner began. After verifying birth records and disqualifying some claims, the contest ended in a four-way tie. 4 women, Annie Catherine Smith, Kathleen Ellen Nagel, Lucy Alice Timleck, and Isabel Mary McLean, had each successfully given birth to 9 children in the specified 10-year period. 2 other women who had given birth to more children were disqualified on technicalities, such as some of their children being stillborn or from an illegitimate relationship. The 4 winning mothers each received about $125,000, a truly staggering sum of money in the midst of the Great Depression. It was enough to buy a large house, provide for their children's education, and live in comfort for the rest of their lives. For these families, Charles Millar's cynical joke had a profoundly positive outcome. They had endured hardship and public scrutiny, and they had won a new life for their children. The story, at least for them, had a happy ending. But the legacy of the Great Stork Derby is deeply ambivalent. It remains a bizarre and unsettling chapter in Canadian history. Charles Millar's will was a cruel and cynical experiment that treated human lives as pawns in a game. It preyed on the desperation of the poor and turned motherhood into a competitive sport. While the winners ultimately benefited, the contest raises profound ethical questions about wealth, reproduction, and the responsibility of the rich towards the poor. It's a story that is both absurdly comical and deeply tragic, a perfect reflection of the strange and cynical mind of the man who started it all. Let's move now from a competition of birth to a competition of death, and explore the strange and deadly history of dueling. For centuries, in Europe and America, the duel was a formal, ritualized system for resolving disputes of honor between gentlemen. It was a practice that was almost always illegal, yet it was widely accepted, and sometimes even expected within the upper classes. The story of dueling is a fascinating look at a world where a man's reputation was considered more valuable than his life, and where a perceived slight could be answered with a pistol shot at dawn. The dream is the ludus, the wooden sword symbolizing freedom. It's incredibly rare. Most gladiators die in the arena within a few years. Freedom is a lottery ticket, and almost no one holds the winning number. The roots of the modern duel can be traced back to the trial by combat of the early Middle Ages, where 2 parties would fight to the death, with the winner believed to have been vindicated by God. By the 16th and 17th centuries in Italy and France, this had evolved into the private duel of honor. A complex and elaborate set of rules, a code duello, emerged to govern the practice. The code dictated everything from how a challenge should be issued, to the choice of weapons, to the conduct of the duel itself. This was not supposed to be a back alley brawl. It was a highly ritualized affair, a piece of deadly theater. The cause of a duel could be almost anything that constituted an insult to a gentleman's honor. This could be a public accusation of lying, a dispute over a gambling debt, a rivalry over a woman, or even a perceived dirty look. The initial insult would lead to a challenge, usually delivered in writing or by a, quote, second, a trusted friend who acted as a representative. The seconds had a crucial role. Their first job was to try and negotiate a peaceful resolution, to see if an apology could be offered and accepted. If no apology was forthcoming, the seconds would then arrange the time, place, and rules of the duel. The traditional dueling ground was a secluded spot, often a field or a clearing in the woods, just outside the city limits, away from the eyes of the law. The duel would typically take place at dawn, adding a certain dramatic flair to the proceedings. The weapons of choice evolved over time. Early duels were fought with rapiers, but by the 18th and 19th centuries, the pistol had become the preferred weapon. A pair of identical, single-shot, smooth-bore pistols would be provided, ensuring that neither duelist had an unfair advantage. The duel itself was a tense and formal ritual. The seconds would measure out the agreed-upon distance. Then, the duelists would take their positions, the pistols would be loaded, and the combatants would be asked one last time if they wished to reconcile. If they refused, the signal would be given. This could be the dropping of a handkerchief or a verbal command. The duelists would then turn and fire. The goal was not always to kill. Often, the duel was fought, quote, to first blood, meaning it would end as soon as one party was wounded. But many duels were fought to the death, or until one party was too injured to continue. The most famous duel in American history took place in 1804 between two of the nation's most powerful political figures, the sitting Vice President, Aaron Burr, and the former Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton. They were bitter political rivals, and their feud had simmered for years. The final straw came when Hamilton made some disparaging remarks about Burr's character, which were published in a newspaper. Burr challenged Hamilton to a duel, and Hamilton, feeling his honor was at stake, accepted. They met at dawn in Weehawken, New Jersey. Hamilton was shot, and he died the next day. The duel destroyed Burr's political career and robbed the young nation of one of its most brilliant minds. So why did men engage in this seemingly barbaric practice? For the aristocracy and the gentry, honor was a tangible asset, the foundation of their social standing and credit. To have one's honor questioned and to not respond was to risk social and professional ruin. The duel was a way of demonstrating that you were a man of courage, a man who valued his reputation above his own safety. It was a system of private justice in a world where the official legal system was often seen as inadequate for resolving matters of personal honor among gentlemen. The decline of dueling was a slow process. As the 19th century progressed, a growing middle class with more practical and commercial values began to see dueling as a barbaric and pointless relic of a feudal past. The press started to mock duelists rather than celebrate them. Laws against dueling began to be more strictly enforced, and public opinion turned decisively against the practice. The senseless death and injury it caused seemed increasingly absurd in an age of industrial progress and supposed enlightenment. By the early 20th century, the formal duel of honor had all but vanished from Western society. The story of dueling is a window into a mindset that is profoundly alien to most of us today. It's a reminder of a time when abstract concepts like honor and reputation could have life or death consequences. It was a world of rigid social codes, where a man's word was his bond, and an insult was a stain that could only be washed away with blood. It's a dark and fascinating chapter in the history of social customs, a deadly dance of etiquette and violence that thankfully we have left in the past. Let's turn now to a story of innovation, obsession, and the quest for perfect timekeeping. We're going to talk about the longitude problem, one of the greatest scientific challenges of the 18th century, and the humble, brilliant, self-taught carpenter who solved it. His name was John Harrison, and his lifelong struggle to create a reliable marine chronometer is a classic underdog story, a tale of a working-class genius battling against the entrenched scientific establishment of his day. It's a story about a clock that changed the world. For centuries, sailors had been able to determine their latitude, their position north or south of the equator, with reasonable accuracy by measuring the angle of the sun at noon or the position of the North Star. But longitude, their position east or west, was a complete mystery. Once a ship was out of sight of land, it was effectively lost in an east-west direction. This made navigation incredibly dangerous and inefficient. Ships would get lost, run aground, or miss their destinations by hundreds of miles. The inability to calculate longitude was costing nations fortunes in ships, cargo, and lives. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. It's a quiet way of letting me know you're out there. So yes, from the cheap seats of history, it looks exciting, but to be a gladiator was to live a short, brutal, and terrifying life, where your only value was in how well you could fight, and ultimately, how well you could die. The problem was, at its core, a problem of time. The Earth rotates 360 degrees in 24 hours, which means it rotates 15 degrees every hour. So if you knew the exact time at your home port, like Greenwich, England, and you could also determine the local time where you were at sea, by observing when the sun was at its highest point, you could calculate the time difference between the two places. For every hour of difference, you were 15 degrees of longitude away from home. The problem was, there was no clock in the world that could keep accurate time on a rolling pitching ship at sea. Pendulum clocks, the most accurate timekeepers of the day, were useless at sea. The motion of the ship would throw off the pendulum's swing. Changes in temperature and humidity would cause the metal parts to expand and contract, and the salty air would corrode the mechanism. The challenge was to invent a timepiece that could withstand these conditions and keep time to within a few seconds a month over a long ocean voyage. In 1714, the British government, desperate for a solution after a naval disaster caused by a navigational error, offered a massive prize, the Longitude Prize, worth millions of dollars in today's money, to anyone who could solve the problem. The scientific elite of the day, including luminaries like Isaac Newton, believed the solution lay in astronomy, not mechanics. They favored the lunar distance method, a mind-bogglingly complex system that involved measuring the angle between the moon and a specific star to calculate the time. This method was theoretically sound, but practically impossible for most sailors to perform accurately on a moving ship, especially in cloudy weather. The idea that a clockmaker could solve the problem was widely dismissed. Enter John Harrison. Harrison was a carpenter and clockmaker from a small village in Yorkshire, with little formal education. But he was a natural mechanical genius. He spent years teaching himself the principles of clockmaking and inventing new solutions to old problems. He invented a gridiron pendulum made of brass and steel rods that compensated for temperature changes, and a new type of grasshopper escapement that was nearly frictionless. He believed he could build a clock that would work at sea. Over the course of nearly 4 decades, Harrison dedicated his life to this quest. He submitted a series of 4 incredible timekeepers to the Board of Longitude, the committee in charge of the prize. His first 3 clocks, H1, H2, and H3, were large, complex, and beautiful sea clocks, weighing over 70 pounds each. They were filled with brilliant innovations, like counterbalance springs and caged roller bearings, all designed to overcome the challenges of a sea voyage. Each clock was a marvel of engineering, and each one was more accurate than the last. But the Board of Longitude, which was dominated by astronomers who favored the lunar distance method, was deeply skeptical of Harrison and his mechanical approach. They prevaricated, delayed, and constantly moved the goalposts. They gave him some money to continue his work, but they refused to grant him a full sea trial or to award him the prize. Harrison, a rough-hewn man from the north, felt he was being snubbed by the London elite, who looked down on his humble origins and his lack of a formal university education. For his 4th attempt, Harrison changed his approach completely. Instead of another massive sea clock, he created something revolutionary, a large pocket watch, just 5 inches in diameter. This was his masterpiece, the H4. It was a culmination of all his life's work, a compact, elegant, and incredibly accurate timepiece. In 1761, the H4 was finally sent on a sea trial, accompanying Harrison's son William on a voyage to Jamaica. After 81 days at sea, the H4 was found to be only 5 seconds slow. It had determined the longitude of Jamaica with an error of just 1 nautical mile. Harrison had solved the problem, but the Board of Longitude still refused to pay up. They claimed the result was just a lucky fluke and demanded another trial. They also insisted that Harrison hand over his clocks and explain their construction in detail so that others could replicate them. Harrison was forced to comply, but he was still denied the full prize. It was only after he petitioned King George III directly that he was finally recognized and rewarded. The king, a fellow enthusiast of science and mechanics, was furious at Harrison's treatment, exclaiming, "By God, Harrison, I will see you righted." With the king's intervention, Harrison finally received the recognition and the money he had earned. John Harrison's story is a triumph of persistence, ingenuity, and quiet genius. His marine chronometers not only saved countless lives and transformed maritime navigation, but they also represented a major shift in the way science was done. He proved that practical, hands-on mechanical skill could solve problems that had baffled the greatest theoretical minds of the age. His clocks were not just tools. They were arguments, beautiful mechanical proofs that a carpenter from Yorkshire could see the world more clearly than the astronomers at the Royal Observatory. Let's now travel to a place that has been called the most mysterious island on Earth. Let's talk about Easter Island, or Rapa Nui, a tiny remote speck of land in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. It is famous for its hundreds of giant, monolithic stone statues, the moai, which stand in silent, enigmatic rows along the coastline. The story of Rapa Nui is a dramatic and cautionary tale of a remarkable civilization that rose in extreme isolation, achieved incredible artistic and engineering feats, and then collapsed into warfare and environmental ruin. Now, let's leave the dust and blood of the Roman Colosseum behind and travel forward in time and far across the globe to the vast sun-baked plains of Western Australia in 1932. Here we find a conflict so absurd, so perfectly strange, that it almost sounds like a tall tale. It's known as the Great Emu War. After World War I, the Australian government had settled thousands of veteran soldiers in this marginal farmland, encouraging them to grow wheat. The problem was, someone else had already claimed this land as their seasonal home. About 20,000 emus, these large, flightless birds, migrating after their breeding season, discovered a delightful, all-you-can-eat buffet of wheat crops and proceeded to decimate them. The farmers, many of them hardened ex-soldiers, were desperate. They appealed to the Minister of Defense, Sir George Pearce. Rapa Nui is one of the most isolated inhabited places on Earth, located more than 2,000 miles from the coast of Chile and 400 miles from the nearest Polynesian island. It was settled sometime between 800 and 1200 AD by Polynesian voyagers who arrived in large, double-hulled canoes after a long and perilous journey across the open ocean. They found an island paradise, covered in lush palm forests, teeming with seabirds, and with fertile volcanic soil. Here, in complete isolation, they developed a unique and complex culture. The most famous expression of this culture is the moai. These are massive statues, carved from volcanic tuff, a compressed volcanic ash, from a single quarry called Rano Raraku. There are nearly 900 moai on the island. They are not just heads. They are stylized representations of deified ancestors, with full torsos, though most are buried up to their shoulders. The average moai is about 13 feet tall and weighs 14 tons. The largest one ever erected was over 33 feet tall and weighed 82 tons. The largest one ever carved, but left unfinished in the quarry, is a staggering 69 feet long and would have weighed an estimated 270 tons. The creation and transport of the moai represent an astonishing feat of engineering for a Stone Age society, with no large animals, no wheels, and no metal tools. The statues were carved directly out of the rock in the quarry using stone tools called toki. Then they had to be transported, somehow, for many miles across the island's hilly terrain to their final destinations on stone platforms called AHU, which were ceremonial sites. How they moved these colossal statues is one of the greatest archaeological mysteries. The prevailing theory is that the islanders used a combination of ropes, sledges, and human manpower. Experimental archaeology has shown that it's possible for a team of people to walk a moai upright by rocking it from side to side and pulling it forward with ropes, much like moving a heavy refrigerator. The oral traditions of the Rapa Nui people speak of the moai walking from the quarry. This method would have required immense social organization, coordination, and, crucially, a lot of wood for the sledges and a lot of strong fiber for the ropes. And this is where the story takes a dark turn. The construction of the moai became an obsession, a kind of competitive status display between different clans on the island. Each clan strove to build bigger and more impressive statues for their ancestors. This moai madness put an enormous strain on the island's limited resources. The lush palm forests that once covered the island were cut down at an alarming rate. The trees were needed for the rollers and sledges to move the statues, for building canoes, for fishing, for fuel, and for clearing land for agriculture. By about the year 1600, the island was almost completely deforested. The environmental consequences were catastrophic. Without the forest canopy, the fertile topsoil eroded and washed into the sea. Without large trees, they could no longer build seaworthy canoes, so their ability to fish in the deep ocean was lost. The seabird populations, a major food source, were decimated. The society that had been rich enough to support a large class of artisans and engineers was now facing starvation. The social fabric of Rapa Nui began to unravel. The old religion, centered on the moai and ancestor worship, seemed to fail them. A new violent cult emerged, the Birdman cult. which involved a dangerous annual competition to retrieve the first egg of a sooty tern from a nearby islet. The society descended into civil war and cannibalism. During this period of conflict, known as the Huri Moai, the warring clans began to topple each other's statues. The Moai, which had once been a source of pride and spiritual power, became symbols of a failed system and were desecrated. When European explorers first arrived in the 18th century, they found a depleted and traumatized society living in poverty amidst the ruins of their former glory. The population, which may have once been as high as 15,000, had crashed to just a few thousand. The arrival of Europeans only made things worse. Disease and slave raids in the 19th century further devastated the population, and by 1877, only 111 Rapa Nui people were left on the island. It was a near-total cultural and demographic collapse. The story of Easter Island has often been used as a powerful parable for our modern world, a stark warning about the dangers of environmental destruction, resource depletion, and unchecked population growth. It's a case study of what can happen when a society fails to manage its resources sustainably. It's the story of a civilization that, in its competitive drive to honor its ancestors, ended up destroying the future for its descendants. The silent, staring Moai are a haunting reminder of this tragic irony. Let's end our journey tonight with a story that feels like it's straight out of a work of fiction, a story of a lost world, a hidden city, and a single-minded obsession that led to a mysterious disappearance. We're going to talk about the legendary lost city of Z, and the man who spent his life searching for it, the British explorer Colonel Percy Fawcett. His quest took him deep into the uncharted jungles of the Amazon, and his ultimate fate remains one of the great unsolved mysteries of the 20th century. Their plea was simple. They needed military assistance to fight a horde of birds. Now, in any other context, this might have been laughed out of the office, but these were respected veterans, and the minister, perhaps seeing a bit of political theater and a good PR opportunity, agreed. He dispatched a small military contingent under the command of a Major G.P.W. Meredith of the Royal Australian Artillery. His forces consisted of himself, 2 soldiers armed with 2 Lewis machine guns, and 10,000 rounds of ammunition. The plan seemed straightforward. Use the machine guns to mow down the large, seemingly unintelligent birds and solve the problem once and for all. The media even got involved, with a Fox movie-tone cinematographer tagging along to capture the glorious victory for the newsreels. It was a war declared on wildlife, with all the pomp and misplaced confidence of a colonial-era military exercise. Percy Fawcett was one of the last of the great Victorian explorers, a larger-than-life figure who seemed to be a blend of Indiana Jones and a mystical philosopher. He was a surveyor for the Royal Geographical Society, and he spent years in the early 1900s mapping the remote and dangerous borderlands between Brazil and Bolivia. During his expeditions, he became fascinated by tales from local tribes and clues he found in old documents about a mysterious, ancient city hidden deep within the jungle, a lost civilization that predated the Incas. He called this city his personal El Dorado, Z. Fawcett's belief in Z was fueled by a document he found in the National Library of Brazil, known as Manuscript 512. It was a report written by a Portuguese explorer in the 18th century who claimed to have stumbled upon the ruins of a magnificent stone city in the Amazon. The report described wide streets, multi-storied buildings, and stone arches. For Fawcett, this was the proof he needed. He became convinced that a sophisticated, technologically advanced civilization had once flourished in the heart of the Amazon, a region that most Western scientists at the time believed was too hostile to support a large, complex society. Fawcett was not just a treasure hunter. He was a romantic and a mystic. He believed that Z was not just a city, but the remnant of a lost Atlantean civilization, a place of profound spiritual energy and ancient wisdom. His quest was as much a spiritual one as it was an archaeological one. He undertook several grueling expeditions into the jungle in search of his lost city, battling disease, starvation, hostile tribes, and the incredible hardships of the Amazon environment. He was known for his almost superhuman endurance and his ability to survive in the most extreme conditions. In 1925, at the age of 57, Fawcett decided to make one last definitive expedition to find Z. He was funded by a group of London financiers and the North American Newspaper Alliance, which gave him a global platform for his adventure. This time, he decided to travel light, with a very small team, believing a large expedition would be too slow and conspicuous. He was accompanied only by his eldest son, Jack Fawcett, and Jack's friend, Raleigh Rimmel. They were determined to travel further into the unexplored Mato Grosso region of Brazil than any European had ever gone before. On May 29, 1925, Fawcett sent his last dispatch delivered by a native runner from a camp he called Dead Horse Camp, so named because his horse had died there on a previous trip. His message was optimistic. He wrote that he was about to enter unexplored territory and that he expected to be out of contact for about a year. After that, nothing. The three men vanished into the green expanse of the Amazon, never to be seen or heard from again. The disappearance of Percy Fawcett became a global sensation. Dozens of rescue missions were launched over the next several decades, and over 100 people died in the attempt to find him. The search for the searcher became a new, tragic quest in itself. Countless theories and rumors emerged about his fate. Had they been killed by a hostile tribe? Had they succumbed to disease or starvation? Or, as some of the more romantic theories suggested, had Fawcett actually found his lost city of Z and chosen to live out his days there, in secret, far from the modern world he disdained? We will likely never know for sure. His story is a powerful testament to the allure of the unknown and the lengths one person will go to chase a dream, even if it leads into the heart of an abyss. And on that note of enduring mystery, I hope you can drift off into your own quiet journey into the unknown. Sleep well. Narration, LIPSA, Narration, LIPSA. The first engagement took place on the 2nd of November. Major Meredith and his men located a flock of about 50 emus. The local settlers attempted to herd the birds into an ambush, a perfect kill zone for the machine guns. The emus, however, proved to be surprisingly brilliant tacticians. Instead of clustering together as expected, they scattered into small groups and ran in unpredictable patterns, making them incredibly difficult targets. The first barrage of machine gun fire was largely ineffective. A second attempt later that day on a much larger flock also ended in failure. The birds were simply too fast, too resilient, and too smart to be gunned down so easily. One of the soldiers noted that the emus seemed to have leaders, with one large black-plumed bird watching over its flock while they carried out their destructive work, and warning them of the soldiers' approach. Major Meredith was baffled. He had faced the German army in the Great War, but this was a different kind of enemy altogether. He famously reported, "If we had a military division with the bullet-carrying capacity of these birds, it would face any army in the world. They can face machine guns with the invulnerability of tanks." The emus were not just dodging bullets. They seemed to be shrugging them off. Their thick feathers and fatty tissue acted like a kind of natural body armor, and even when hit, they would often keep running. The soldiers with their tripod-mounted Lewis guns were designed for static defense, not for shooting at fast, erratic targets across open terrain. The war was quickly becoming a frustrating and slightly embarrassing exercise in futility for the Australian military. The 10,000 rounds of ammunition were being spent with very few results to show for it. The campaign continued for several days with depressingly similar results. In one infamous attempt, the soldiers mounted a Lewis gun on a truck, hoping to chase the emus down. This technical, a sort of precursor to what you might see in modern guerrilla warfare, proved to be a comical disaster. The ride was so bumpy that the gunner couldn't get a clear shot, and the truck couldn't keep up with the birds anyway. At one point, an emu ran into a fence and got tangled, providing a perfect stationary target. But in the frantic chase, the truck swerved to avoid the bird and crashed through the fence itself, bringing the pursuit to an ignominious end. After nearly a week of this, and with about 500 rounds fired for a grand total of maybe 50 to 200 dead emus, the operation was called off. The press had a field day. What was meant to be a show of force and competence had turned into a national joke. The media coverage was merciless, portraying the mighty Australian army as being outsmarted and outmaneuvered by a flock of giant birds. A conservationist in the Australian Parliament dryly commented that the emus had won every round so far. Faced with public ridicule and a distinct lack of dead emus, the Minister of Defense recalled Major Meredith and his men. The First Great Emu War had ended in a decisive victory for the emus. The farmers were, of course, still having their crops eaten, and they again pleaded for help. The Premier of Western Australia even supported their call for a renewed military effort. Against his better judgment and a wave of negative press, the Minister of Defense authorized a second go. On November 13th, Major Meredith was sent back into the field, a little wiser and perhaps a lot more cynical. This time the military had slightly more success. They adopted better tactics, ambushing smaller groups and getting closer before opening fire. Over the next month, they managed to kill just under 1,000 emus, using nearly all of their remaining ammunition to do so. But the numbers were still a drop in the bucket. 20,000 emus were in the region, and killing 1,000 of them did very little to stop the crop damage. It was becoming clear that military intervention was a costly and inefficient way to deal with an agricultural pest. In December, Major Meredith was recalled for good. His final report noted that there had been no further army casualties, a detail that only highlighted the absurdity of the whole affair. The government, having learned its lesson, decided to try a different approach. They implemented a bounty system, which proved to be far more effective. In a 6-month period in 1934, over 57,000 bounties were claimed. The farmers, using their own knowledge of the land and more conventional hunting methods, were far better suited to the task than soldiers with machine guns. The Great Emu War was officially over. It remains a strange and humorous footnote in military history. A perfect example of how a problem that seems to call for overwhelming force is often better solved with a little local knowledge and a less dramatic approach. And now, let's leave the battlefields of Australia and turn our attention to something a bit more domestic, something you might even have used today without a second thought. Let's trace the long, surprisingly controversial, and often dramatic history of the fork. For most of human history, eating was a hands-on affair. People used their fingers, a knife to cut meat, and a spoon for liquids. The idea of a small, pronged instrument for lifting solid food to your mouth was seen as bizarre, unnecessary, and in some corners deeply sinful. The fork didn't just appear on our tables. It had to fight its way there, battling against tradition, religion, and deep-seated cultural norms. It's a story about how a simple tool can become a symbol of profound social change. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from. I love seeing our little community of night owls and history lovers spread all across the globe. It's a nice thought as we all settle in. The earliest known ancestors of the fork were large, two-pronged instruments used in ancient Greece for carving and serving meat from a pot, much like a modern carving fork. They were kitchen tools, not personal eating utensils. The idea of a personal fork first seems to have taken root in the upper echelons of the Byzantine Empire in the Middle East around the 7th century. It was a symbol of incredible wealth and refinement. In the 11th century, a Byzantine princess named Theodora Anna Ducana brought a case of golden forks with her when she married Domenico Selvo, the Doge of Venice. The Venetians were utterly scandalized. They saw her use of a fork as a sign of decadent, foreign pride. When she died of the plague a few years later, some saw it as divine punishment for her hubris. One of the most prominent critics of the fork was a man named Peter Damian, an ascetic monk, and later a cardinal. He viewed the fork's delicacy with profound suspicion. He wrote of the Byzantine princess, "She would not deign to touch her food with her fingers, but she would command her eunuchs to cut it up into small pieces, which she would then spear with a certain golden two-pronged instrument and so carry it to her mouth." To him, this was an insult to God. He believed God had given us fingers to eat with, and to use an artificial hand like a fork was a sign of excessive vanity and a rejection of God's design. This theological argument against the fork would persist for centuries, casting it as a tool of the devil, a symbol of effeminate luxury and moral decay. The fork slowly, very slowly, made its way across Europe, primarily through Italy. The Italians, particularly in Florence and Venice, were famous for their pasta dishes, and trying to eat slippery noodles with just a spoon in your fingers was a messy business. The fork was a practical solution. By the 14th century, it was becoming more common among the Italian merchant and upper classes, but it was still viewed with deep suspicion elsewhere. In France, the fork was seen as an absurd Italian affectation. It was considered unmanly. A real man used his fingers and a knife. Using a fork suggested you were too delicate or finicky to touch your own food. This cultural resistance meant that for a very long time, the fork remained confined to Italy. It wasn't until Catherine de' Medici arrived in France in 1533 to marry the future King Henry II that the fork began to make inroads into French high society. She brought with her a whole retinue of Italian chefs and, of course, her personal collection of silver forks. The French court, always keen on new trends in fashion and etiquette, began to tentatively adopt the strange little instrument. However, it was still largely a novelty for the ultra-wealthy. King Louis XIV, the Sun King a century later, famously preferred to eat with his hands and forbade his children from using the forks that had become fashionable at his own court. The fork was still fighting an uphill battle against deeply ingrained habits, even at the very pinnacle of European society. The real turning point for the fork came with changes in fashion. In the 17th and 18th centuries, large, elaborate ruff collars became the height of style for the European aristocracy. Suddenly, eating with your hands became a logistical nightmare. It was nearly impossible to bring food to your mouth without soiling your expensive and elaborate collar. The fork, with its long handle, was the perfect solution. It allowed a diner to bypass the ruff and deliver food cleanly to their mouth. Etiquette in this case was driven by practicality and fashion. As ruffs became more common, so too did the fork. It transformed from a symbol of sin and effeminacy into a tool of cleanliness and sophistication. The design of the fork also evolved. Early forks typically had only two straight tines, making them great for spearing chunks of meat, but not very good for scooping up things like peas. In the late 17th century in France, and then later in Germany and England, a curved design with four tines became the standard. This new design was far more versatile. You could use it to spear food, but you could also turn it over and use it as a scoop, almost like a spoon. This innovation, combined with the rise of a middle class that was eager to emulate the manners of the aristocracy, finally cemented the fork's place on the dining table. It became a marker of good breeding and civility. England and America were among the last Western cultures to fully embrace the fork. The Puritans, in particular, viewed the fork with the same suspicion as the early Catholic clergy, seeing it as a frivolous, ungodly, and vaguely Italian instrument. For a long time, the common practice in America was fork and knife, where you would cut your food with a knife in your right hand, then switch the fork to your right hand to spear the bite and lift it to your mouth. The European style of keeping the fork in the left hand was seen as an affectation. It's a subtle difference in etiquette that still persists today. By the 19th century, with the advent of mass production, forks made of cheaper materials became available to everyone, and its long, strange journey was finally complete. So the next time you sit down to a meal and pick up your fork, you can remember its wild history. This simple, everyday object was once a symbol of sin, a marker of foreign decadence, an object of ridicule, and a sign of incredible wealth. It fought a centuries-long battle against popes, kings, and cultural tradition to earn its place at the table. It's a quiet reminder that even the most mundane parts of our lives are filled with stories of conflict, change, and the slow, inexorable march of ideas. It's not just a fork. It's a tiny, pronged monument to the evolution of how we live. Now let's move from the dining table to the starry skies of the 16th century and meet one of history's most brilliant and most gloriously eccentric scientists, Tycho Brahe. He was a Danish astronomer whose meticulous observations of the heavens laid the groundwork for Kepler's laws of planetary motion and, ultimately, Newton's theory of gravity. But Tycho is remembered just as much for his bizarre life as he is for his scientific genius. His story is a wonderful tapestry of groundbreaking science, aristocratic indulgence, a prosthetic nose, a party animal pet moose, and a death that is still debated by historians. He was a man who contained multitudes, and most of them were very, very strange. Tycho was born into the Danish nobility in 1546. From a young age, he was fascinated by the stars. While studying law at the University of Copenhagen, a predicted solar eclipse occurred exactly on time, and the 13-year-old Tycho was astounded. He was hooked by the idea that the movements of celestial bodies could be predicted with mathematical precision. He began to dedicate his life to astronomy, much to the chagrin of his noble family, who saw stargazing as a rather common and unsuitable profession for a man of his station. But Tycho was stubborn, and he was about to prove just how stubborn he could be in a rather dramatic fashion. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for some white noise, and get into that perfect spot. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. At the age of 20, while studying at the University of Rostock in Germany, Tycho got into a dispute with his third cousin, another Danish nobleman named Manderup Parsberg. The subject of their argument? A mathematical formula. They argued heatedly at a party, and their egos, fueled by youth and probably a fair amount of alcohol, could not let it go. They agreed to settle the matter with a duel. In the darkness of a December evening, they fought with swords, and Parsberg's blades sliced off the bridge of Tycho's nose. For the rest of his life, Tycho wore a prosthetic nose, which he would attach with a paste or glue. It was said to be made of a blend of silver and gold, and he reportedly carried a small box of the adhesive with him at all times to keep it in place. This incident, rather than derailing his career, seemed to cement his reputation as a passionate and formidable character. His big break came in 1572 when he observed a new star in the constellation Cassiopeia. Today, we know this was a supernova, the explosive death of a star. But at the time, the prevailing Aristotelian view was that the heavens were perfect and unchanging. Tycho's incredibly precise measurements showed that this new star was far beyond the moon, located in the realm of the fixed stars. This discovery shattered the ancient model of the cosmos and made Tycho famous throughout Europe. It was a direct, observational challenge to a 2,000-year-old idea, and it was a massive step forward for science. His newfound fame caught the attention of King Frederick II of Denmark. The king, an enthusiastic patron of the sciences, wanted to keep his star astronomer in the country. So, in 1576, he made Tycho an offer he couldn't refuse. He gave him the entire island of Ven, in the strait between Denmark and Sweden, along with a massive pension and funding to build the greatest observatory the world had ever seen. Tycho named his research institute Uraniborg, the Castle of the Heavens. It was part palace, part observatory, part laboratory. It had its own printing press, workshops for building instruments, and even an alchemical laboratory in the basement. It was a scientific utopia, funded entirely by the state. Life at Uraniborg was as eccentric as its master. Tycho ruled the island like a feudal lord, collecting rents from the local tenants, who were often not pleased with his rule. He also kept a court dwarf named Jep, who he believed was clairvoyant. Jep would sit under the table during banquets, and Tycho would occasionally feed him morsels of food, believing that anything Jep said would come true. But perhaps the most famous resident of Uraniborg, aside from Tycho himself, was his pet moose. The moose, which we would call an elk in North America, would apparently wander around the castle like a dog. Unfortunately, the moose met a tragic and frankly ridiculous end. Tycho had loaned his pet moose to a fellow nobleman on the mainland for a party. The moose, unaccustomed to such festivities, proceeded to drink a large quantity of beer, stumbled up a flight of stairs, fell, and broke its leg. It subsequently died. This story, which sounds like something out of a comedy sketch, is a perfect illustration of the strange blend of high science and absurd indulgence that characterized Tycho's life on Hafen. He was a man creating the most accurate astronomical data in history, charting the course of planets with unprecedented precision, all while his court dwarf muttered prophecies under the table and his drunken pet moose was meeting its untimely end. For 21 years, from Uraniborg and a later observatory he built called Stjerneborg, Star Castle, Tycho and his assistants compiled an enormous and incredibly accurate catalog of the stars and planetary positions. He did all of this without a telescope, which had not yet been invented. He used massive, custom-built instruments like quadrants and armillary spheres, which he designed himself, to measure the angles between celestial objects with astonishing precision. His data was orders of magnitude more accurate than any that had come before. He was creating the raw material that would allow the next generation of astronomers to figure out the true structure of the solar system. Tycho's own model of the cosmos was a strange hybrid. He couldn't bring himself to accept the full Copernican model, which had the Earth orbiting the Sun. It felt counterintuitive, and he couldn't detect the stellar parallax that should result from the Earth's movement. So he proposed his own Tychonic system. In his model, the Sun and Moon orbited the Earth, but all the other planets orbited the Sun. It was a clever, but ultimately incorrect compromise. However, Its real value wasn't the model itself, but the mountains of observational data he had collected to support it. That data was his true, lasting legacy. After his patron, King Frederick II, died, Tycho fell out of favor with the new king, Christian IV. His funding was cut, and his arrogant personality had made him many enemies at court. In 1597, he left his island paradise of Gavin, and, after a couple of years of wandering, he was appointed the imperial mathematician to the Holy Roman Emperor Rudolf II in Prague. It was here, in 1600, that he hired a brilliant but struggling young mathematician to be his assistant. That assistant was Johannes Kepler. It was a fateful meeting of two of the giants of the scientific revolution, the greatest observational astronomer of the age and one of the greatest theoretical astronomers of all time. Their relationship was complicated. Tycho was secretive and protective of his data. He didn't want Kepler, a confirmed Copernican, to use it to prove a model he disagreed with. He doled out the data in small pieces, giving Kepler only the information on the orbit of Mars to work on. It was a tedious and frustrating task for Kepler, but it was also the key that would unlock the secrets of the solar system. The orbit of Mars was particularly tricky and elliptical, and it was by wrestling with Tycho's ultra-precise Mars data that Kepler would eventually discard the idea of perfect circular orbits and discover his three laws of planetary motion. Tycho's end was as strange as his life. In October 1601, he attended a banquet in Prague. According to the long-held story, told by Kepler himself, etiquette of the day dictated that it was a grave insult to leave the table before the host. Tycho, having drunk a large amount of wine, needed to relieve himself but politely refused to get up. He held on for an excruciatingly long time. When he finally got home, he was in agony and unable to urinate. A fever set in, and he became delirious. After 11 days of suffering, he died. For centuries, the story was that his bladder had burst, a cautionary tale about the dangers of politeness. Let's start with the recruitment process, which is a very polite term for it. You didn't really sign up. You were either a prisoner of war, a condemned criminal, or a slave sold by a master who was tired of you. However, modern science has cast doubt on this colorful story. Tycho's body has been exhumed twice, once in 1901 and again in 2010. The analysis looked for evidence of mercury poisoning, as it was rumored that he may have been murdered, perhaps by a distant relative on behalf of the Danish king, or even by Kepler, who was desperate to get his hands on the precious data. The most recent analysis concluded that the levels of mercury in his system were not high enough to have been fatal. The most likely cause of death was probably a burst bladder leading to uremia, or perhaps a severe urinary tract infection that turned septic. So the old story, as strange as it sounds, is likely true. Tycho Brahe, the man who measured the heavens, died because he was too polite to go to the bathroom. Let's shift our focus once again, this time from the grand observatory of a nobleman to the humble, muddy trenches of World War I. We're going to talk about a very specific and peculiar phenomenon of that conflict, the trench club. It's a weapon that feels almost medieval, a brutal and primitive tool in what was otherwise the first truly modern, industrialized war. The story of the trench club is a fascinating look at how, even in an age of machine guns, artillery, and poison gas, warfare can revert to its most savage and personal forms. It's about the grim necessity of close-quarters combat and the horrifying ingenuity it inspires. When World War I began, the armies involved expected a war of movement, of grand cavalry charges and decisive battles. What they got was a stagnant, horrifying stalemate. Millions of men dug into a vast network of trenches that stretched from the Swiss border to the North Sea. Life in these trenches was a miserable existence of mud, rats, disease, and the constant, nerve-shredding threat of artillery fire. But the real terror often came at night, during the trench raids. These were small, brutal missions where a handful of soldiers would creep across the shell-pocked wasteland of no man's land to attack the enemy's trench directly. The goal was to gather intelligence, capture prisoners, and generally terrorize the enemy. In the tight, narrow confines of a trench, a standard-issue rifle with a long bayonet was almost useless. It was too long and unwieldy to swing around corners or in a crowded dugout. Firing a rifle was also a bad idea, The muzzle flash would give away your position to enemy snipers and machine gunners, and the loud report would alert the entire sector. Soldiers needed a weapon that was quiet, compact, and devastatingly effective at very close range. They needed something for what was grimly called the silent killing. And so they began to improvise, reaching back into the dark ages of warfare for inspiration. The result was the trench club. These were not mass-produced, standard-issue weapons. Most were handmade in makeshift workshops just behind the front lines, or even by the soldiers themselves during quiet moments. Their designs were a testament to grim creativity. The simplest versions were just a solid piece of wood, often from a broken tool handle or a piece of scavenged lumber, with something heavy and nasty attached to the end. This could be anything from a large nut or bolt to a piece of scrap metal. The goal was to create a weapon that could crush a helmet and the skull beneath it with a single, silent blow. Many of the more elaborate designs became quite famous. The British Army, for example, had a number of official patterns, though soldiers still made their own. A common design involved turning a wooden club on a lathe and then studding the head with hobnails, the same kind used on the soles of army boots. This created a weapon that looked strikingly similar to a medieval mace. Some were even more vicious, with sharp metal spikes or flanges designed to inflict maximum damage. The Germans were known for similar weapons, often with a cast-iron head. These weren't tools of a civilized army. They were instruments of brutal, personal violence, designed for one purpose. Alongside the club, soldiers also improvised other close combat weapons. Trench knives became common, some of them featuring a knuckle-duster hilt for punching. Shovels were sharpened on one edge to be used as a makeshift axe, a surprisingly effective and terrifying weapon. Even entrenching tools, the small spades soldiers used for digging, could be sharpened and wielded with deadly effect. The trench raid was a return to a primal form of combat. It was dark, chaotic, and intensely personal. You were close enough to see the face of the man you were fighting, close enough to hear him breathe. In that terrifying intimacy, the primitive club was king. Imagine yourself as a young soldier, your face blackened with cork or grease paint, huddled in your own trench waiting for the signal. Your weapon isn't a sophisticated rifle, but a heavy piece of wood in your hand. You have a few grenades, a knife, and maybe a pistol. Your heart is pounding in the silence between artillery shells. Then, the officer gives the word, and you climb over the top, into the darkness of no man's land. You move as silently as possible, crawling through mud and tangled barbed wire, trying not to make a sound that could bring a storm of machine gun fire down on you. The tension is almost unbearable. You are not a soldier in a grand army anymore. You are a hunter, stalking your prey in the dark. Finally, you reach the enemy trench. You slip down into the narrow passage. It's a maze of sandbags and wooden planks, smelling of damp earth, rot, and fear. This is where the club becomes your primary tool. You round a corner and come face to face with an enemy sentry. There's no time to aim a rifle, no space to lunge with a bayonet. There is only the swift, brutal arc of the club. The fighting is chaotic and desperate. A flurry of grunts, screams, and the sickening thud of wood on bone. It is over in seconds. The goal is not to win a battle, but to survive this one encounter. Grab a prisoner if you can, and get back to your own lines before the whole world erupts in retaliatory fire. The Trench Club is a powerful symbol of the paradox of World War I. It was a war of incredible technological advancement, with airplanes, tanks, and chemical weapons changing the face of battle forever. Yet, at its heart, it was also a deeply primitive conflict. The technology created a stalemate so absolute that it forced soldiers back into a form of combat that a medieval knight would have recognized. The club represents the failure of technology to provide a clean, distant solution to the problem of war. It reminds us that when all the complex machinery fails, conflict often comes down to the grim, personal business of one human being attacking another in the dark. You arrive at the Ludus, the Gladiator school. It's not a place of learning and camaraderie. It is a prison, a barracks, and a training yard all rolled into one, smelling of sweat, fear, and cheap barley porridge. Now let's leave the grim realities of the trenches and travel to a place of myth, legend, and archaeological mystery. Let's talk about the lost city of Helig. For centuries, it was mentioned in ancient texts as a powerful and prosperous city in ancient Greece, the capital of the Achaean League. But one winter night in 373 BC, it vanished. The city, along with its entire population, was wiped off the map in a single cataclysmic event, swallowed by the earth and the sea. For over 2 millennia, Helike became a legend, a Greek Atlantis, a ghost story told by writers like Pausanias and Strabo. Its location was lost, and many believed it would never be found. According to the ancient accounts, the destruction of Helike was a terrifying spectacle. For 5 days leading up to the disaster, the residents witnessed strange omens. Snakes, mice, and other animals that normally live underground were seen fleeing the city in droves, heading for the high ground. Then, on the fateful night, a massive earthquake struck. The ground beneath Helike, which was built on a coastal plain of unstable sediment, simply liquefied. The entire city sank into the earth. Immediately following the earthquake, a massive tsunami, generated by the seismic shock or an associated submarine landslide, rolled in from the Gulf of Corinth and washed over the sunken ruins, erasing any trace of the city from the coastline. The ancient writers attributed the disaster to divine wrath. Helike was a major center for the worship of Poseidon, the god of the sea and earthquakes. The story goes that the people of Helike had angered the god. A delegation from a colony of Ionian Greeks had come to Helike to request a copy of the city's famous statue of Poseidon, or at least a model of their temple. The citizens of Helike arrogantly refused. As punishment for this impiety, Poseidon, the city's own patron deity, unleashed his full fury upon them. It was a powerful morality tale in the ancient world, a warning against hubris and disrespecting the gods. For centuries, this story was all that was left of Helike. In the aftermath, the site became a macabre tourist attraction. Roman travelers wrote of sailing over the submerged ruins, peering down through the water to see the tops of buildings, and the famous bronze statue of Poseidon, still standing upright in the murky depths, a silent, submerged monument to his own destructive power. Fishermen would report snagging their nets on the remnants of the city, but as the centuries passed, silt from the nearby rivers slowly buried the ruins under a thick layer of clay and mud. The location became less certain, and eventually, the memory of where Helike once stood faded completely. It became a ghost, a name in a book. For modern archaeologists, finding Helike was a holy grail, but it was an incredibly difficult task. The ancient accounts were vague on the exact location, and the landscape had changed dramatically over 400 years. The coastline had shifted, and the rivers had deposited dozens of meters of sediment. Many early searches focused on the deep waters of the Gulf of Corinth, assuming the ruins were still submerged at sea, just as the Roman writers had described. These searches, using sonar and underwater equipment, found nothing. The lost city remained lost, and the mystery deepened. It seemed that Helike had truly vanished without a trace. The breakthrough came from 2 archaeologists, Dora Katsinopoulou and Stephen Soter. In 1988, they launched the Helike Project. They came up with a radical new theory. They believed that the previous searches were looking in the wrong place. Based on a careful rereading of the ancient texts and an understanding of the local geology, they hypothesized that the ruins were not in the sea at all, but were buried deep inland, in what was once an ancient lagoon that had since silted up and become a coastal plain. They reasoned that the Roman boating trips over the ruins took place in this lagoon, which was later filled in by sediment, hiding the city under solid ground. They began a systematic search, drilling boreholes and analyzing soil samples in the plain between the mountains and the modern coastline. It was slow, painstaking work. For over a decade, they found tantalizing but inconclusive evidence. Pottery shards from the right period, bits of destroyed buildings. Then, in 2001, they hit the jackpot. They unearthed the ruins of a building with clear evidence of destruction from the classical Greek period. And in 2012, they finally found what they were looking for: a massive, well-preserved section of the city buried under several meters of clay, exactly where their theory predicted it would be. They had found the lost city of Helike. The excavations have revealed a remarkable snapshot of a city frozen at the moment of its destruction, a Greek Pompeii. They have found cobbled streets, the walls of buildings, and a wealth of artifacts, including pottery, loom weights, and coins. The archaeological evidence perfectly matches the ancient accounts. The layers of clay and silt show clear signs of liquefaction from an earthquake, followed by marine deposits from the tsunami. They even found a layer of dark organic material that they believe is the remnants of all the plants and animals that were destroyed in the cataclysm. The discovery of Helike is a triumph of modern archaeology, a perfect blend of ancient history, geology, and persistent, methodical scientific inquiry. The story of Helike is a powerful reminder of the impermanence of even the greatest cities, and the terrifying power of the natural world. But it's also a story of rediscovery and the resilience of memory. For 2,000 years, Helike was just a story, a whisper from the past. But the story was enough to keep the memory alive, to inspire generations of searchers to look for it. And now, thanks to the dedication of modern researchers, the ghost city is slowly re-emerging from its muddy grave, giving up its secrets and allowing us to finally understand the reality behind the myth. It's a connection across millennia, a conversation between our world and one that vanished in a single, terrible night. Let's turn now from a city lost to a man who found himself, quite literally, on a different planet. Let's talk about the strange and lonely odyssey of Arland D. Williams, Jr., a man often referred to as the sixth passenger of the Air Florida Flight 90 crash. His story isn't one of grand historical events, but of quiet, profound heroism in the face of certain death. It took place on a bitterly cold and snowy afternoon in Washington, D.C., on January 13, 1982. It's a story about the choices we make in our final moments, and how a single act of selflessness can resonate with a power that outlives the tragedy itself. Your diet is famously terrible. You're known as a horarius, a barley man. You're carb loading on an industrial scale, not for energy, but to build a layer of fat over your muscles to protect you from superficial cuts. Air Florida Flight 90 was scheduled to fly from Washington National Airport to Fort Lauderdale, Florida. The city was being hit by a major snowstorm, and the airport was temporarily closed to allow for plowing. When it reopened, the plane, a Boeing 737, was de-iced, but a series of delays on the ground meant that snow and ice began to build up on the wings again. The flight crew made a series of critical errors, including failing to activate the engine's anti-icing system. As the plane took off, the ice on the wings disrupted the airflow, and the engine pressure sensors gave false readings. The plane failed to gain altitude. Less than a minute after takeoff, the plane stalled. It clipped the 14th Street Bridge during rush hour, smashing several cars and killing 4 motorists on the bridge, before plunging into the freezing, ice-choked waters of the Potomac River. The impact tore the plane apart. Of the 79 people on board, only 6 initially survived the crash, left clinging to the tail section of the aircraft in the icy river. The water was just a few degrees above freezing, and hypothermia would set in within minutes. The survivors were in a desperate race against time, in full view of the horrified commuters stuck in traffic on the bridge above. A United States Park Police helicopter, Eagle 1, arrived on the scene within minutes. The crew, pilot Donald W. Usher and paramedic Melvin E. Gene Windsor, began a series of incredibly risky rescue attempts. The weather was still terrible, with heavy snow reducing visibility. They first dropped a rescue line to one of the survivors, Bert Hamilton, and managed to pull him to shore. Then they went back. The problem was that the helicopter's skids were just inches above the icy water, and the rotor wash was creating a blinding spray and pushing the survivors around. It was a chaotic and terrifying scene. The helicopter crew returned to the remaining group of survivors. Time and time again, they lowered a rescue line or a flotation ring. And time again, one man in the water, Arland D. Williams, Jr., caught the line and immediately passed it to someone else. The first time, he passed it to flight attendant Kelly Duncan. The helicopter pulled her to safety. They returned, and again, Williams caught the line and passed it to another passenger, Joe Stiley. Stiley, who was going into shock and partially blind, grabbed the line, along with another survivor, Priscilla Tirado. The helicopter tried to pull them both, but Tirado lost her grip and fell back into the water. As the helicopter returned for Stiley, a bystander on the shore named Lenny Skutnik saw Priscilla Tirado struggling and unable to grab the line again. In an incredible act of bravery, Skutnik, a 28-year-old office assistant at the Congressional Budget Office, took off his coat and boots, dove into the freezing river, and swam out to pull her to shore. He became a national hero, honored by President Reagan at the State of the Union address a few weeks later. Meanwhile, the helicopter had successfully delivered Joe Steely and another passenger, Patricia Felch, to safety. Now, only one man was left in the water. The helicopter, Eagle One, went back for the last survivor. They went back for the man who had passed the lifeline to everyone else. But when they got there, he was gone. Arlen D. Williams, Jr., the 46-year-old bank examiner, had finally succumbed to the cold and drowned. He had spent his last minutes of life floating in the freezing Potomac, ensuring that every other survivor had a chance at life before him. He had the opportunity to be saved at least twice, and both times he chose to save someone else instead. He remained anonymous for some time, known only as the sixth passenger, the one who didn't make it. When his identity was finally confirmed, his story of quiet sacrifice captured the heart of the nation. He wasn't a trained rescuer or a soldier. He was an ordinary man who, in the most extraordinary and terrifying circumstances imaginable, made a conscious decision to put the lives of strangers ahead of his own. He acted without fanfare, without anyone even knowing his name. His heroism was quiet, profound, and absolute. It wasn't a single act of impulsive bravery, but a repeated, deliberate choice to save others at the cost of his own life. Arlen D. Williams, Jr. was posthumously awarded the Coast Guard's Gold Life-Saving Medal. The 14th Street Bridge, the very bridge the plane had struck, was renamed in his honor. It is now the Arlen D. Williams, Jr. Memorial Bridge. His story is a powerful testament to the human capacity for altruism. In a moment of pure chaos and self-preservation, he chose compassion. It's a haunting and deeply moving story because it's so simple. There was no complex motive, no hope of reward. There was only a man in freezing water, handing a lifeline to a stranger, again and again, until he had no strength left. Now let's turn from an act of individual heroism to a moment of collective madness. A historical event so strange it feels like it belongs in a fairy tale or a horror story. Let's travel to the city of Strasbourg in the Alsace region, in the heart of the Holy Roman Empire, in the summer of 1518. Here, a bizarre and terrifying phenomenon broke out, one that historians and scientists still struggle to fully explain. It is known as the Dancing Plague of 1518. It started with one woman, and it ended with hundreds of people dancing uncontrollably in the streets, some of them dancing until they collapsed from exhaustion or even died. In July of 1518, a woman known as Frau Trophea stepped out of her house and into a narrow Strasbourg street and began to dance. There was no music. She just danced, silently and fervently. Her expression was not one of joy or celebration. She seemed to be in a trance, unable to stop. She danced for hours, her husband and neighbors watching in confusion and alarm. She continued to dance for nearly a week, stopping only when she collapsed from exhaustion, her feet bloody and bruised. Then, after a short rest, she would get up and start again, her body seemingly possessed by a relentless, invisible rhythm. This wasn't about being lean and ripped. It was about being survivable. A fleshy exterior could stop a blade from hitting a vital organ, which was a very practical, if deeply unglamorous, form of armor. Within a week, the phenomenon began to spread. A handful of other people, mostly women, joined Frau Trophea in her compulsive, silent dance. Soon, there were dozens. The city authorities were baffled and concerned. At first, the local physicians and the city council made a diagnosis that seems bizarre to us today. They ruled out astrological or supernatural causes and concluded that the plague was a natural disease caused by hot blood. And their prescribed cure? More dancing. They believed that the sufferers needed to dance the fever out of their systems. They thought the only way to cure the mania was to let it run its course. To facilitate this cure, the authorities took a series of remarkable steps. They cleared out 2 of the city's guild halls to create dance halls. They even constructed a large wooden stage in the public grain market. They didn't just allow the dancing, they encouraged it. They even hired professional musicians to play pipes, horns, and drums, hoping that the music would help the afflicted to sweat out the illness. This, of course, had the opposite effect. The sight of the stages and the sound of the music seemed to encourage even more people to join the frenzied, ever-growing crowd of dancers. The cure was making the disease worse. The scene in Strasbourg must have been surreal and terrifying. Hundreds of people were now dancing day and night in the summer heat. They weren't dancing with skill or joy. It was a grotesque, desperate spectacle. Their movements were jerky and convulsive. They were screaming in pain, their faces contorted in agony, but they could not stop. The city's chronicles report that at its peak, the plague was killing up to 15 people a day. The cause of death was usually heart attack, stroke, or sheer physical exhaustion. The city's attempt to provide a medical solution had turned into a publicly sanctioned death rave. After several weeks of this horrifying spectacle, the authorities finally realized their mistake. Their more dancing cure was a catastrophic failure. They changed their strategy completely. They now declared that the plague was the result of divine anger, specifically the wrath of Saint Vitus, a saint who was known to curse sinners with compulsive dancing. The city council ordered a stop to all public dancing and music. The sufferers were rounded up, put into wagons, and taken to a mountaintop shrine dedicated to Saint Vitus, where they were to pray for forgiveness and absolution. At the shrine, the dancers were led around a wooden effigy of the saint. They were given small crosses and red shoes which were sprinkled with holy water. And then, slowly, the phenomenon began to subside. Within a few weeks, the last of the dancers had stopped their frantic movements, and the plague was over. The city of Strasbourg breathed a collective sigh of relief. The dancing plague had lasted for over a month and had affected as many as 400 people. The bizarre and terrifying summer of 1518 finally came to an end. So what actually caused the dancing plague? Historians and scientists have proposed several theories. The first, and most obvious one to consider, is some kind of food poisoning. Specifically ergot, a toxic mold that grows on damp rye, which was a staple grain at the time. Ergot poisoning, or ergotism, can cause convulsions, muscle spasms, and hallucinations. It's the fungus from which LSD was first synthesized. However, while some symptoms match, others don't. Ergotism typically restricts blood flow to the extremities, which would make coordinated dancing for days on end almost impossible. Also, not everyone in the city who ate rye bread was affected. The more widely accepted theory today is that the dancing plague was a case of mass psychogenic illness, also known as mass hysteria. This is a phenomenon where a group of people under extreme stress begin to exhibit similar physical or psychological symptoms for which there is no clear physical cause. The people of Strasbourg in 1518 were under immense stress. They had just endured a series of famines, harsh winters, and diseases like smallpox and syphilis. There was a deep sense of fear and desperation. The culture was also steeped in a superstitious belief system, where divine curses, like the one from Saint Vitus, were considered a very real threat. In this context, Frau Trofea's initial dance might have acted as a trigger. In a psychologically vulnerable population, the sight of her inexplicable behavior could have planted a powerful suggestion. People believed they could be afflicted with a quote-unquote kind of dancing curse, and so, when they felt overwhelmed by anxiety or fear, their minds and bodies manifested that belief in the form of uncontrollable dancing. It became a kind of stress-induced trance state, which was then reinforced and amplified by the authorities' disastrous decision to encourage the dancing. It was a perfect storm of stress, superstition, and misguided public policy. The dancing plague of 1518 remains one of history's most bizarre and unsettling episodes. It's a stark reminder of how vulnerable the human mind can be to the power of suggestion and collective anxiety. It shows how a shared belief, even a terrifying one, can take on a physical life of its own. It's a story that blurs the line between medicine, psychology, and sociology, a haunting example of a time when an entire city was gripped by a madness that forced them to dance themselves to death in the summer sun. Let's move from a crowd of unwilling dancers to a single solitary figure who chose a life of extreme isolation. We're going to explore the strange and fascinating world of the stylites, or pillar saints, of late antiquity. These were early Christian ascetics who, in a radical act of devotion and self-denial, chose to live for years, sometimes even decades, on top of small platforms at the top of tall pillars. It's a form of religious practice that is almost impossible for us to comprehend today, a testament to a level of spiritual endurance and physical deprivation that is both awe-inspiring and deeply strange. Your living quarters are a cramped, shared cell. Privacy is a forgotten luxury. Disease is rampant. You sleep next to men you might have to kill next week, all while listening to the sounds of training and quiet despair. The trend was started by a man named Simeon Stylites the Elder in the 5th century. Simeon was a Syrian ascetic who initially sought solitude in a monastery, but he found the communal life too distracting for his intense brand of devotion. He wanted a more extreme form of mortification to bring himself closer to God. First, he sealed himself up in a small hut for the Lenten fast. Then he had himself chained to a rock in a cave. But pilgrims and followers kept finding him, seeking his blessing and advice. Frustrated by the lack of true isolation, he came up with a novel solution. He would go up. Around the year 423, Simeon found a ruined pillar in the Syrian desert, about 40 miles from Aleppo. He built a small platform on top of it and climbed up, resolving to live out the rest of his days there, exposed to the elements, far from the distractions of the world below. His first pillar was only about 9 feet high, but over the years, as his fame grew, and as he sought to get even further from the crowds that gathered below, he moved to progressively taller pillars. His final pillar was said to be over 50 feet tall, with a small platform at the top, just a few square meters in area, and a low railing to prevent him from falling off in his sleep. Life on top of the pillar was an exercise in extreme endurance. Simeon was completely exposed to the blistering Syrian sun in the summer and the freezing winds and rain in the winter. He had no shelter. He spent his days in prayer, meditation, and a form of continuous, rhythmic bowing that astonished the crowds below. He ate very little, subsisting on small amounts of bread and water that were hoisted up to him in a basket by his followers. His physical condition, as you can imagine, deteriorated. He suffered from ulcers on his legs and was constantly plagued by insects and the elements. But for Simeon, this suffering was the point. It was a way of purifying his soul and demonstrating his devotion to God. You might think that living on top of a 50-foot pillar would guarantee solitude, but you would be wrong. Simeon Stylites became a massive celebrity. His bizarre act of piety attracted huge crowds of pilgrims from all over the Christian world. They would gather at the base of his pillar, shouting up questions, seeking his blessing, or asking him to mediate disputes. He became a kind of oracle and a judge. Letters would be hoisted up to him, and he would send his replies back down. Even emperors and generals sought his counsel. His isolation had paradoxically made him one of the most influential public figures of his time. Simeon lived on top of his pillar for 37 years, never once coming down. When he finally died in 459, his followers had to climb up to retrieve his body. His legacy was immense. His extreme form of asceticism inspired a whole generation of imitators. For the next several centuries, the Syrian desert and other parts of the Byzantine world were dotted with these strange figures, the Stylites, each perched on their own pillar, praying, fasting, and offering advice to the crowds below. It became a recognized, if extreme, path to sainthood. There were even female Stylites, though they were much rarer. The most famous of Simeon's successors was Daniel the Stylite, who brought the practice to the heart of the empire near Constantinople. He lived on a pillar for 33 years, surviving blizzards and storms and becoming a trusted advisor to several emperors. The logistics of this lifestyle were staggering. The pillar itself had to be stable. There had to be a system for raising food and water, and for lowering waste. The Stylite had to have a community of supporters on the ground to manage the crowds and see to his basic needs. It was a life of solitary devotion that was, ironically, entirely dependent on a community below. So why did they do it? What motivated someone to choose such a life? From their perspective, it was a way to escape the temptations and sinfulness of the world. By elevating themselves physically, they believed they were also elevating themselves spiritually, moving closer to heaven and further from the corruption of the earth. The physical suffering was a form of martyrdom, a way of emulating the suffering of Christ and the early Christian martyrs. And in a world without mass media, their pillars acted as giant billboards for their faith, a dramatic and unforgettable public performance of piety that could inspire thousands. The practice of stylitism eventually faded out around the 15th century, though a few isolated examples persisted in the Eastern Orthodox Church even longer. Today, it seems like one of the strangest chapters in the history of religion, but it's a powerful story about the incredible lengths people will go to for their beliefs. It challenges our modern ideas of comfort, community, and what it means to live a meaningful life. The image of a lone figure, silhouetted against the sky on a slender column, is a haunting and powerful symbol of a faith so intense that it drove people to abandon the world entirely, only to become the center of it. Let's come down from the pillars of Syria and dive into the depths of the ocean to explore a mystery that has captivated treasure hunters, historians, and conspiracy theorists for over a century. We're going to talk about the legendary U-boat of gold, a story that combines the grim reality of submarine warfare in World War I with the tantalizing allure of lost treasure. The legend centers on a specific German submarine, the UB-65, and the belief that it was carrying a vast fortune in gold to fund German agents and allies abroad when it sank under mysterious circumstances. It's a tale where historical fact and maritime folklore get tangled together. The UB-65 was a Type UB-3 submarine of the German Imperial Navy, launched in 1917. From the very beginning, the boat seemed to be cursed. During its construction at the shipyard in Hamburg, a heavy steel girder fell and crushed 2 workers. During its first sea trials, a toxic gas leak in the engine room killed 3 more crewmen. And just before its first official war patrol, a sailor was washed overboard during a storm and drowned. These incidents created a dark cloud of superstition around the submarine. The crew began to whisper that the boat was haunted, that a ghost, perhaps of one of the dead workers, was stalking its narrow corridors.